everybody. This is Craig from the Pacific War Channel. This is Echoes of War. Joined here by my co-host Gaurav. How are you?
Hey Greg, wonderful to be back here and looking forward to a different theater of our series.
Certainly is different. So we are continuing the 7 Years War series. This obviously is going to be the North American aspect of that. It's also known, well, here, because I live in Quebec, it's known as the French and Indian War. We're going to be joined here by our other guest, Simone. How are you?
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited for this part of the series because I know very little about what is happening there.
Yeah, no one does. This is literally something that's taught as 80% of the curriculum for high school in Quebec because it's the most important aspect of it, I guess you could say. But for the rest of the world, especially for Americans, this is like very not talked about much. I think maybe Braddock's expedition is known to Americans, but other than that, they don't really care so much about this. And maybe the Battle of Quebec. But I'm going to try and do this in 10,000 words or less. This is brutal for me. It's like telling the entire history of the establishment of the nation I live in a nutshell. I'll do my best. But before we jump into it, I implore the audience, please join us on YouTube. I had to make an entire separate document so that these guys might be able to help me out with all the maps because there's like technically more than 50 battles involved, although we're only going to be talking about a few. I'll have to gloss over many of them. And there's going to be portraits and all sorts of other stuff. It's a visual experience. Please, you can check us out on the Pacific War Channel, or maybe this might be on Kingston General's YouTube podcast channel, as there might be a transition going on by the time this comes out. Also, if you'd like to further support us, please consider checking out the YouTube membership or the Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series. You also get early access to all the content I make and voting rights to the subjects I will tackle next. Stating all of that, I'm going to be the first one to toss up a little map. We're going to be going through a little history of Nouvelle France 101. So, for anyone not from North America, a brutal summarization. You have Christopher Columbus. He founds the New World, quotation marks. It was already found by,
So Amerigo Vespucci is pretty upset hearing this. And the Vikings.
Yeah. I was going to say, fishermen. There's a lot of reports of French, Portuguese, Spanish fishermen that were just on the coast. They just didn't want to tell anybody that they had found, other stuff. So there's a lot of technical people.
Or if I just go on a Discord where there was this great conspiracy guy who was convinced the ancient Phoenicians in 550 BC reached the Americas, right? Because his great solution for water supplies was the sailors would just tow 2 triremes behind them.
Of course, yeah, of course. The ancient Egyptians made it too, right? The lost tribes of Israel. There's all sorts of conspiracy theories. I shouldn't even talk about this here because it's going to be a long podcast. But the original idea that Polynesians made it to South America, which was discredited for a long time, I read not too long ago. Apparently, they do have evidence. They think they did make it. So, crossing the Pacific Ocean somehow, some people may have got to South America pretty early. It's kind of interesting. But lack of better words, so the Spanish and Portuguese, they colonized Latin America as we know it. The British fail initially to colonize parts of what we know as modern day America, and then they get a second go at it, and it goes pretty well. The French under Jacques Cartier managed to get a foothold in what is Quebec. Let me look at the map here. Going through the St. Lawrence, so that's the giant river that enters the part in the north over there, all the way to Quebec, and then eventually to Montreal. And there's many people that come after Jacques Cartier that found all sorts of stuff, like Champlain and all that. I'm not going to go through the entire history of Nouvelle France, but the French are very good at establishing relationships with the native allies because there's very few French actually doing this. France did not put a lot of money into the expeditions until the fur trade came about, and that was a big boost. So initially, Nouvelle France was doing much better than the British, but the British eventually will send a lot more people, and that's going to be kind of the crux of this. But Basically, like always, Britain and France, they have to find a reason to be rivals. And when it comes to the New World, it's over trade. It's the fur trade initially. And they're treating their colonies as just kind of,
Can I just say, is it
yeah.
them wanting to just find another reason to fight?
Yes, absolutely. Because the distances that their settlements are, like they shouldn't run into each other for a long time. It's pretty ridiculous. But so it's over trade initially. They're treating their colonies like just a distributor for raw materials, and the mindset is there's a competition for territory and dominance over the trade, and there's going to be a insanely long history of border conflicts and claims, which is over resources, and even you could consider the relationships they have with Aboriginal groups as kind of resources, because they are fighting to be befriending certain groups that are dominant in the area and that can acquire the things that they need. So before we even get into the French and Indian War, I have to mention there's like a ton of other wars. There's the King William's War, 1689 to 1697, Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713, and King George's War, 1744 to 1748. And more or less, this is just a series of conflicts that involve also the natives that we'll talk about in a bit. Cycles of violence, and it's creating an atmosphere where they're always expecting a fight. So in King William's War, the English colonists and their native allies clashed with the French forces and their allied native allies, and this is in the series of raids and small battles along against their settlements and along the trade routes. It results in devastation on both sides, but no one is definitively winning a quote-unquote war. Queen Anne's War extended the hostilities, ended with the British acquiring Newfoundland and Acadia under the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, though French claims in the interior remained. And if you're looking at the map, you can see that the technical French territory is extending across middle America, through the Mississippi River. I think I've said this in other podcasts. This is complete bullshit. It's a handful of Coureurs du Bois, or these French traders who are just there with native allies on their little boats, making like rudimentary outposts here or there, but there's nobody in these territories. Like it's very much paper tiger stuff here. So the French they're claiming the interior, so they've bottled up the British. And then we have King George's War, which intensifies. It's quite larger, and there's a lot of border raids, especially in the area of Maine, where colonial militias retaliate against French-supported indigenous incursions. So basically, what the French and British do is they get their native allies to fight for them. They just send them to attack settlements and stuff. British colonial strategy
so
centered on.
Can we just call them mercenaries?
Absolutely, especially I'll get into the different groups, but the Haudenosaunee are quite the mercenaries. British colonial strategy centered on dense coastal populations and westward settlement pressures, while the French were relying on their sparser interior networks anchored by river systems. So you got the Great Lakes, and then you have the Mississippi, where more or less they're just there to get beaver pelts and such. And this is not to knock on it. There's a huge economy made by the fur trade. The Russians are starting in the Pacific to do their own kind of fur trade. It's a whole thing. A lot of money involved. By the 1750s, British colonies in North America housed more than 1 million people. It's an insane number for the time, enabling agricultural surplus, substantial land hunger that's pressing beyond the Appalachian barrier. The French, they're numbering about 64,000. So you have to keep that in mind. We're talking about a population of 1 million, another one that's just above 50,000 people. And this is across what we consider Nouvelle France.
So are you telling me the blue and the purple has just 64,000 Frenchmen?
And the purple? Very sparse. This is very, like, people today, hard to live in these areas. The climate's bad in the Hudson Bay area. And the French out there, these are just like trader outposts, okay? They're just there to find the Inuits or the Aboriginal Cree that can get them the furs. There's like not many French up there. The British, of course, they get the rights to this. And there's this great hope of, I don't know if you ever heard of the Great North Passage ever opening up and such, blah blah blah. But yeah,
No
not much
wonder
going on
Napoleon
there.
just seems so obsessed with just holding territory and not strategic value during Russia.
Yep. But the Hudson Bay is very profitable because it just happens to be a good place where you can at least sail into it parts of the year, because yeah, it does ice up, and you can get all those furs on the boats easier, because the further you go into the interior, unless you're using the river network, which the French kind of own, you're not really going to be doing it. Logistically, it's kind of a nightmare. But yeah, so
just 50 dudes behind the wall everywhere.
Exactly, that's pretty much it. The French are, they're holding this vast territory, but honestly, the French are relying almost completely on their Aboriginal allies, whereas the British, they don't need to as much, we'll say that much. But the British fur trade ventures, their land speculation outfits into the Ohio Company. So they're looking into the Ohio Valley, that's going to be the crux of everything. They're becoming obsessed because they feel like they're bottled in. They are bottled in. Their population is building up, and they really want to go into the Ohio Valley to capitalize on it because it's very fertile, the soil over there. And there's a lot of indigenous groups that are very powerful in the area. And if you can ally to them, well, you're going to be making a lot of money. War is inevitable, despite what's going on with the 7 Years' War. Well, that's about to spring up. So Native American diplomacy unfolded in all this with, a landscape of basically they're looking at it from there's these rival trade giants around them. The tribes sought reciprocal trade benefits, and they often favored the French, who were offering them goods with less encroachment on their tribal lands. So the difference is, before the British actually became a dominant power, the Dutch were. The British actually just stole everything the Dutch had, like they did in the rest of the world. The Dutch had established relations with the most dominant.
Britain is probably just going to say, yeah, we're Protestant brothers, so we're good.
Yeah, but the Dutch were pretty decent towards the Aboriginals. Of course, again, when I say decent, they're very small in number. When you're outnumbered heavily, you tend to treat these people nice. So that's why later on, when the British are not as nice to their Aboriginal allies, it's because they have the upper hand on them more. And that's why the French are always seen as, quote unquote, the nice guys in this. No, they were heavily outnumbered, and they had no choice. They had to abide by what the natives wanted. So they're exchanging European manufactured goods. Anything like cooking pots is very popular. Early on, natives really liked shiny objects because it had something to do with an internal trade network that they had. Natives, of course, would love to get their hands on guns.
You just made them sound like magpies.
Well, okay, I had to write in university a whole paper on this. There's this symbolic. There was a trade network that technically went to Latin America all the way up to the northeastern parts of what we call Canada, and they traded for like shiny objects, and there's reasons for this. It's ceremonial. It's for garments, things that they were making, and all that. But there's a spiritual nature to it. Anything that could reflect was seen as kind of this other spiritual thing. But they were very enamored by a lot of metal goods initially. And that's kind of like the French initially, it was pots and pans and stuff, firearms. Despite the stereotype of alcohol being traded en masse, that's not actually true. Everyone was drinking. It was a predominant native thing to only want alcohol. But yeah, they did trade for alcohol and stuff. Anything that was seen as European good. So that's kind of the trade that's going on. And the British, they extend their trade network to a group that's known as the Iroquois Confederacy. So I'm going to bring up this, and we can't get into all of it, but as you can see here, the thing in the middle called the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, that is the Iroquois Confederacy. It's a group of quite a few tribes. Oh, here we go. I can zoom in this area here.
Weren't they known for great horsemen and cavalry for the area? Though I'm just basing this. No, maybe I'm just confusing from another tribe because of Age of Empires 3. Because the Act 2 of the campaign is literally 7 Years' War with the Russians invading North America.
For the cavalry, you're looking at, the Pacific side. You're looking at the Apaches, the Comanches, Comanche Empire. They're the great cavalry natives and
But the natives
modern-day
now
dominate.
had also began to use firearms, right?
Yeah, slowly, because you have to purchase them, you have to learn how to use them and such. And the British would actually be outfitting their natives with firearms more so than the French would be. Uh, yeah, big time. But it's important to note that the Dutch opened up the door to this relationship, and the English would inherit it. And the Iroquois Confederacy is the most dominant in this region. They could butcher just about everybody else. So the British are allied to the most powerful group. And I'll get into the different groups in a bit. So we were talking about the Ohio country, so the Ohio River Valley. This is the flashpoint that really starts up the conflict because everyone is competing over the fertile soils and the strategic riverine access, which links the Appalachian routes to the Mississippi River system. The French claims trace back to René Robert Cavelier, the Sieur de la Salle, who descended from Ohio in 1669. A little piece of information: the river was also known as the Belle Rivière, and it was integrated into a broader assertion over sovereignty over the Mississippi watershed. And this is all formalized in the 1682 voyage to the Gulf of Mexico. A bunch of French guys got in a boat. They went through the Mississippi River Valley. British
and then they just said this is our property.
Yeah. They put a few outposts. That was the way that they thought the legality worked in North America. You put an outpost every, I don't know, freaking 50 kilometers, who knows? And then you say, yep, no, we own all of this land. They don't even know the Aboriginal groups in the area. They have no concept of anything.
I'm really considering if I should use this kind of tactic to try to buy up real estate here. Just
hammering a sign into the wall and saying, "This is mine now."
Oh yeah, let me put up the one sec. So my screen always seems to go black now and then for some reason. I have an issue with my HDMI.
Let me know if you need me to bring up one of the maps then.
When we get to the battles, I'll try to take it over for a bit. So I just wanted to bring up the map that shows kind of the territories again. So that's the French claim is they went down the Mississippi River. That's in a nutshell. The British, their counterclaim rests on a bunch of royal charters, notably Virginia's 1609 grant, which extended access going west towards the Pacific. But as you can see on the map, there's a wall, the French, because they've already basically pigeoned them in the middle of the continent.
This is just a question for my knowledge. Did any explorer from any of the countries, right, because they would have settled on the Atlantic coast, have they made it across to the Pacific coast?
Well, the Spanish and I don't know if the Portuguese, yeah, well, I guess technically the Portuguese also. The Spanish and the Portuguese made it to the Pacific. And if you're looking like right now at what it shows as the quote unquote territory of Spain, that goes up a little bit into California. Technically, the Spanish have a lot more rain in the Pacific, and the Russians are also coming into where is Alaska. So the British and French would have had either knowledge from these other sources, or they would have had personnel that did some voyaging with them, but they don't have claims. So yeah, they're aware of generally what the Pacific looks like, but this is kind of limited to Alaska and what we call California today. The middle part hasn't been really explored much because the Russians were way too busy doing their own fur trade, and they were just kind of going across the coast, and they were also running into the Japanese and stuff. It's an entire other history.
And not to mention, they were at this time, they were literally trying to modernize and fight each other between Peter the Great and the boyars as well. I mean, that was just going on in Russia, but that would have just
the 5,000 kilometers of Siberia that they have to, you know, trek just to get to the other side. So yeah, they're way too big of an empire to really be able to capitalize. That's kind of why they lost Alaska in the end. There's too much. And the Spanish really run out of steam, and the Spanish pissed off a lot of native tribes before anybody else. So in the area where you see kind of California, this is the rise of the most powerful tribes, in my opinion. Like you're going to see later on, like the Comanche Empire rise up. So that's territory that can't be settled. It's way too too violent. But back to the story at hand. The 1748 Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle ended, with the War of Austrian Succession. It restored the pre-war boundaries, but it did not resolve the inland frontiers that was inherited by the Utrecht Treaty. It's a vacuum. It's spurring renewed. There's a lot of people doing new surveys. There's more encroachments. France views British traders in the region as threats to Nouvelle France's fur trade monopoly, which, yeah, if you looked at the numbers, Nouvelle France has pretty much a monopoly on the fur trade, and they're making a insane amount of money, aside from the Russians, but the Russian trade is kind of a whole different story. And yeah, the French obviously want to keep this. It's nowhere as good as what's going on in the Caribbeans, but that's another story. But the French, they did some expeditions to reassert their possessions. The British, meanwhile, they chartered the Ohio River Valley using the Ohio Company of Virginia. This is in 1749. And they're
Can I just
granting
consider this the American equivalent for the British of the East India Company?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it's pretty much, that's a good way to put it. And they grant like 200,000 acres, to the area. And this is between the Monongahela and the Kanawha rivers. It's a Ganyagea word over there. That spur expansion and secure trade dominance. Escalation, is then stemming from both sides who view basically that this is their area. And there's also the Iroquois Confederacy that's also getting involved. The Iroquois are basic. It's funny to call them that because they're a confederacy of many tribes. They're viewing this like, who's going to win? Who can we do business better with? And they implicitly endorse the British because they think that they're going to be the guys who can push forward. And I mean, there's 1 million population on that side, so it kind of seems obvious the British are the better choice. They're weakening the French alliance system.
Yeah, and just adding one more thing. As we discussed in the other 7 Years' War episodes, the British strategy is the government from London is going to be supporting the colonies with supplies and the powerful Royal Navy, whereas the French will be like, we're busy fighting Frederick the Great and Hanover.
And in general, the French, France never really supported Nouvelle France that much. I mean, it was more of a Catholic mission, if anything. It's kind of the church doing most of the stuff. Like, it's shocking given the amount of wealth the fur trade was giving France that they didn't invest that much into it. But yeah, I guess they didn't have the means either. Even though they were kind of the first guys
you're
to
still
the game.
not considered French speakers, right? Till the States.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, but at least you can always rely on the Catholics trying to convert everyone.
Exactly. That's what the Spanish and the French are doing best out here. And I can't get into it, but no one ever talks about there's a huge German presence in North America. There's an enormous Dutch presence. There's some Swedish colonies. There's a lot of places that are called like New Berlin, New Stockholm and all that, but no one seems to care.
Why don't US cities are just New something?
Yeah, that's the trope.
Hey, the only city that immediately come to my mind is just the city of Bismarck.
Yeah, there you go. And a lot of these names were actually changed during World War I, by the way. So like, what is it? London, Ontario was New Berlin. There was a German. Yeah, there's a bunch of German places that were renamed because of the war and all that. But yeah, there was a lot of other groups involved. Just they didn't put as much people, and it's kind of obvious that the British were suffocating the Atlantic coastline with their population. But there was efforts at diplomacy, but diplomacy just meant that each side was just sending ultimatums to expel the other one to try and like buy them off and stuff. But it wasn't really, there's no compromise that was going to be made. So
relatively better diplomacy than Frederick the Great. Relatively being the key word.
Probably. I wonder if I can bring up this map. I don't want to bring it up just yet because we're not getting into the war itself. I'm still talking about pre-war stuff. I'm going to try and do this as fast as I can. So in 1749, French captain Pierre-Joseph Caron de Blainville led a force of about 200 soldiers and officers and Coureurs de Bois, we'll call them Canadian voyagers, down the Allegheny and Ohio rivers to assert French sovereignty in the Ohio Valley and to expel, the British traders that were encroaching the region. Caron's party buried about 8 lead plates inscribed with French declarations of sovereignty and key tributaries, including one at the mouth of Wheeling Creek on August 18th. And this is all to proclaim that the lands, are theirs and it's under, Louis XV's authority. The expedition also was there to warn the British fur traders to get the hell out of their territory. So it's kind of like, two mafias fighting over their part of the city. And so they do that. British officials viewed the Ohio region as, like I said, granted by royal charter, and they were supported by the Iroquois, who's basically controlling the entire area. And they're trying to pursue some diplomatic challenges to the French expansion. On October the 31st of 1753, Virginia's governor, Robert Dwindy, it's a weird name, commissioned 21-year-old George Washington. And I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say about him, Gaurav, because I did mention doing a few bios, but
Yeah, I just could not find a good image of him because I don't want to put the images for the Revolutionary War in his career after,
yeah,
because
of course.
it's not appropriate for this. But if you were to talk about George Washington
Young
during
George
this
Washington.
conflict, yeah. So he was a pretty competent guy and experienced. Plays a role in Age of Empires 3, I might add, in Act 2. All right, supporting the protagonists. But he was involved in what we would call the Jumonville Glen incident, which is a minor skirmish. He was there at several other key battles and commanding regiments. But what was the most important thing you could say that came out for George Washington, the future founder and first president of the United States, is he learned with experience and the hard way the necessities and intricacies and skills for higher command. He learned how to, keep logistics real, tactical adaptation, and be a more calm leader under fire, which obviously are going to be great traits that are going to serve him well in the future. But yeah, that's just a very limited thing I'll want to add here because he's not going to be a critical officer here.
No.
He's still a pretty junior guy. He's just, at the most, I think he just commands the Virginia regiment at most during this time of and this is towards the end of the war.
Yeah, and at this point in the history, he's very young. He's 21 years old, and he's sent to deliver a formal ultimatum to the French forces at Fort Le Boeuf, demanding their withdrawal from the lands that the British are claiming. And Washington arrives on December the 12th. He presents the message to Jacques Le Gardien de Saint-Pierre, because back then the French had the most ridiculous names, and of course the French reject it, asserting French authority based off of everything I keep repeating. This exchange just highlights the mutual miscalculations. Both sides are kind of claiming these charters and these rights, and they're not understanding that why would either their governments care? They haven't respected each other for the past 150 years. Like, it doesn't make sense anyways. But Washington did note that the French were extremely hospitable about, everything. They treated him right, treated him well, and I want that to be a message because I'm going to talk a little bit about Washington and something that the Americans might be surprised to hear. And that's something that we're all taught in Quebec high school in the education system, certainly are. So the Iroquois Confederacy, again, they're the most influential in the Ohio Valley since the Beaver Wars, which probably sounds hilarious to you guys. There was something called the Beaver Wars, and it was over beaver pelts. It was actually pretty brutal.
I'm actually just imagining beavers or like the Union Jack and the fleur-de-lis.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, they definitely had control of the rivers then.
Yeah. Kind of a funny fact. The natives and the French and the British killed so many beavers, it changed the entire river system of North America. So the population of beavers was actually what was creating different lakes and rivers and everything. And the fur trade screwed it all up. And in a very fast manner.
This just reminds me of the lobster war that also took place between Brazil and France.
Oh, you mean the court war between Iceland and Britain?
Gotta love the animal wars.
The animal wars are good. Yeah. So the British are, of course, they're invoking the Iroquois deeds because they're saying the Iroquois are backing them up. The Iroquois say that this territory is theirs. It's not the Iroquois territory. They're just bullying other groups. And we're going to get some characters like Tenochtitlan, who's the half king, who are going to bolster, the claims against the French. But the Iroquois Confederacy is still very reluctant to commit to either side in what looks like is going to be a war because they want to be on the winner's side. In response to the British encroachments in the Ohio River Valley, French authorities under Governor Ange Duquesne du Meniville initiated a series of fortifications to secure territorial claims on the waterways, because that's what they did. They just built outposts everywhere. The first major effort, happens in spring of 1753 when Captain Paul Marin de la Mallugue led roughly 600 Canadian militiamen, some regular soldiers, and some native allies from Montreal. And their objective was to establish a chain of posts controlling access to the Ohio River to counter the British. Construction started at Presqu'île, it's a funny name, on the southern shore of Lake Erie, where engineers were erecting wooden stockades, and this is in May, to anchor the northern terminus of a critical portage route. From there, laborers, including militiamen and native auxiliaries, such as the Shawnee and Delaware, they're pioneering a 50-mile road through dense forests and some swamps. And this is all going to Fort Le Boeuf, which is on French Creek. And this work is beginning in July. And the fort features a square palisade with bastions designed for basic defense in the harsh terrain. And it serves as a staging point for any further encroachment. So yeah, by late 1753, after Marin's death, Lieutenant Colonel Claude Pierre Cadet de Contrecoeur, French names are that's so funny. That name is great. Assumes command and presses onward, directing the completion of Fort Marshall at present-day Venango before reaching the forks of Ohio, and this is in 1754. And at this point, I think I'm going to bring up the new map. So this is going to be like kind of the staple map of the entire war. In April, crews are building Fort Duquesne on the confluence of the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers, utilizing more than 300 soldiers, militiamen, and a lot of canoes. So they're deploying 18 artillery pieces here. So it's getting kind of heavier. The forts are, embodying basic French doctrine at the time. Go in the interior, make a fort, hope it's enough to deter the British. Now, for the British, in response to all of this encroachment in the Ohio Valley, Virginia Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie mobilized colonial forces to defend the chartered territories, and he issued some proclamations in late 1753 and in 1754 calling for volunteers to form expeditions against the French. Dinwiddie authorized by royal instructions the raise of militia units independent of the metropolitan direction, which underscores, the provincial assertions of self-defense rights, just to go into the legality of it. And broader, one sec, I want to go through my notes here, so I don't want to keep repeating myself on all this stuff. We don't need to talk too much about the legality of it, because I already did with the proclamations. So early on, there's a stark numerical disparity, obviously. Virginia expeditions totaled roughly 300 men in 1754 when they went to the Ohio, while the French detachments are going to exceed about 1,000 troops. So despite the British having a lot more people, the French had actually placed significant manpower in the area, and the British are not so much at the beginning. But and I have to mention the French are also being bolstered by their native allies. And this imbalance is going to compel the British colonists to emphasize defensive postures for the moment being, and to formalize more so their alliance with the Iroquois Confederacy to offset the French strength. Now, at this point, I kind of want to just take a moment to talk about the commanders involved in all of this, and it's going to go further into history because I kind of want to get it out of the way immediately. So we're going to be talking about people we'll meet soon. The French and Indian War saw a lot of overall military commanders emerge and then disappear. The reality is that command usually fell upon whoever was in the region at the time. And it could be, usually it could just be a governor who, was in charge. So if there wasn't an immediate strong commander, it fell onto usually colonial governors. And that's for both sides. But during the early phase of this war, which is 1754 to 55, the initial commander for the French side is actually an interesting character. It's Baron Jean Armand Descaux. I don't know if you have any information on him, Gaurav. He's an elusive character.
Just what I was able to find is, yes, as you mentioned, he was German. He actually was born in Saxony, though spent his career as an military aide. And, he fought in the War of Austrian Succession, War in Polish Succession, and reached the rank of Major General in the French army. And he was actually pretty new to France, you could say, because his posting to North America was in 1755. I think that's just a little bit good find out about.
More or less, the French didn't want to place any significant commanders in the theater of Nouvelle France because obviously they're looking at Europe as the only thing that matters. And even the Caribbean, they're putting more significance on because it's technically becoming much more lucrative with the sugar trade. So they hired more or less, we'll call him like a mercenary. And yeah, he's the backbone. He's actually the overall commander during the early phase. In most Quebec textbooks, they don't even mention him because he's not really French. So yeah. Concurrently, the British have their own commander, and he's not the overall commander, but I'm just going to name him anyways because he's someone who's well known. There's Major General Edward Braddock, who was commander-in-chief February of 1755. It's kind of famous in video games, I would imagine.
Yep, I put his Assassin's Creed 3 character portrait up. Yeah. Yep, because you do get to kill him in the game at the start.
Did you want to say anything about him? I don't know.
Yeah, just a little bit. Born in 1695, he was technically considered the de facto commander-in-chief of British forces in the French and Indian War. And while he was considered to be a seasoned veteran of the European gentlemanly warfare, he was pretty ruthless as well. So, because he was a disciplinarian by nature. Very rigid, close order drills, linear tactics, just a standard run of the mill European tactics. Again, also pretty new to America. He arrived in 1755 with 2 regiments to drive the French out of the Ohio Valley. And yeah, I think that's just a little bit because I don't want to get into his military career yet because that's what you're going to be covering.
But definitely think of him as someone who's, disciplined, military type, but he's disciplined in we'll call it the European style tactics. And that's going to be a theme of this. There's 2 types of military commanders. There's those who are hamstrung to how war is fought in Europe. And then there are those usually local born commanders who are more experienced with the natives and understand, we'll call it guerrilla warfare. This is
they know the terrain warfare and the restrictions that's going to bother them.
Yeah. And we won't go into more into Edward Braddock. And then, of course, after things happen, we'll just say, by mid-1756, the French commander is going to be Lieutenant General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. Did you want to say anything about Montcalm?
Just a little bit. Let me also just bring up his lovely portrait. Not really, but just had to say that.
Get the portrait of him dying?
Oh no, I decided to be. I reserved that for another individual.
Okay. Yeah, it's 2 famous paintings.
You already know.
Yeah.
But Montcalm was a very influential and experienced soldier. By the time he actually arrives in Canada in 1756, he's already participated in 11 campaigns in Europe. He was wounded 5 times, actually taken prisoner in the Battle of Piacenza. And similar to what he said about Braddock, right? The old school thought, he believed in the set piece battle, which was going to put him at odds with the requirements of the terrain and kind of warfare that they're going to go through here. And despite that, he's gonna have a pretty successful career for a good part of the first half of the war, you could say, like the first few years. But he is not really good with the governor. They have their own little rivalry.
Legendary.
And he's also going to be killed in the same battle of this individual I was referring to, but not yet. Not going to bring that person up yet.
Because I will be shitting on Montcalm a lot, rightfully so. To give him some benefit of the doubt, he was a military man since the age of 15, and he had significant experience in Europe, specifically for siege warfare, and he understood mobile defense, and his knowledge of siege warfare did really help him in North America because surprisingly, sieges were important. A little bit different than what you see in Europe, but definitely they're important. Almost every battle's around a fort on a lake, so it kind of helped him to have this knowledge. But to his detriment, Montcalm was exceptionally angry to be in Nouvelle France. He hated it. He wrote extensively to his wife and other military commanders that he wished to be in Europe where actual battles were happening, as he called it. And he loathed two groups of people. The most was the natives. The second one was the people of Nouvelle France. He hated the militiamen, and he hated how they did warfare. He thought it was disgusting, like guerrilla warfare. He did not like, the hit and run tactics that they were using and such. And this definitely drove a wedge between him and his greatest asset, because as we'll see in the series, the early victories of the French is mostly due to guerrilla warfare and particularly their better use of native allies. And like you mentioned, he runs completely against his opposite, which at the time was Governor Vaudreuil. I don't know if you have anything to say about Vaudreuil.
Yeah, just bringing up his portrait. Just one moment.
Oh, okay.
So, please pardon my ignorance if I mispronounce his name, but Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil Cavagnal was, one of the most controversial figures. He was considered the first and only Canadian-born Governor General of Nouvelle France.
Yeah, definitely.
And he was defined by fierce loyalty to the colony. So kind of opposite to Montcalm, who hates everybody there. He loves everybody here. And like I said, he was born in Quebec, so born and raised in the New World, you could say. He was the son of the previous Governor General, so he was already colonial aristocracy. And he served in other such administrative posts. And during his time in Louisiana, where he was doing such governor duties, he actually was able to hone and master the craft much better of how to work and negotiate with the various Native American tribes to kind of get them onto his side, get them to work for them, because that's what they definitely needed. And as I mentioned, he had a huge rivalry with Montcalm, where he favored guerrilla tactics. Montcalm was obviously the set piece battle, and Montcalm obviously wanted more professional regulars from France to be sent over, whereas he was using the indigenous allies and the colonial militia. And this is also a big difference of where they diverged was their goals. Vaudreuil wanted to distract the British with raids to keep them away from the heart of New France's territory. Whereas Montcalm, obviously being the guy who wanted the set piece battle, was concentrating all his forces for a decisive engagement. And that was also how they viewed it. Vaudreuil actually believed that continuous hit and run attacks are going to completely wear down the British. Whereas Montcalm was the Redcoats are a pretty competent force. They can only be defeated by sheer discipline and structure and rigidity. But yes, he would be, there when Canada falls to the British, you could say. When he returns to France in 1761, he is the scapegoat and imprisoned in the Bastille. But for a year, he was imprisoned in 1762 and would be exonerated in 1763 because the court said that while he did lose us the colony, they still blame him. He served the crown faithfully, and we can't ignore that.
And I will point out, he absolutely was the reason why everything was lost. The most significant town beside me is Vaudreuil. Shouldn't be named after him, in my opinion. But yeah, and you mentioned different style of tactics. Vaudreuil was aware of the history of all the border conflicts that they had. Every time England and France went to war in Europe, They just had to wait out a few years and then nothing much would happen in Canada. So he figured like this was the same exact situation. They didn't have to lose everything. That maybe they could cede a bit of territory, but Nouvelle France would survive. Whereas Montcalm was obsessed with that, putting his name on, in the books, and he wanted a fantastic battle, and he forced engagements. And of course, they're complete opposites. On the other
Which
side, we
is
have
from Military 101. That's really stupid when you force an engagement just for the sake of forcing an engagement.
exactly.
You force it when you have the advantage.
Yeah,
that's literally the rule of set piece battles.
To give Montcalm a bit of a benefit, early on he did have fantastic victories, but he should have taken a defensive posture and done exactly what Vaudreuil was doing. Rely on the natives to try and, raid them, harass them, screw up their logistics. Because anytime you go in the interior, it's a nightmare. And those stupid little forts the French have in all the riverways, it would be a bit of a hurdle. So they could have really delayed things. But anyways. On the other side, of course, I think you want to talk about this guy as Major General James Wolfe.
Yeah, I feel like so excited talking about him. The only reason is I literally had a book called History's Greatest Hits, talks about battles of Agincourt, Stalingrad, Battle of Cannae, and then you have Battle of Quebec.
And why would Battle of Quebec make that book? I mean,
don't ask me, but
hey, you wrote maybe a Canadian.
Reason. It's an okay battle, like, all right.
But yeah, Major General James Wolfe. First of all, one of his most iconic features was he did not powder his hair, as we could see in this portrait of him, which was against the norm of the world. He was someone that believed he's going to be dying in every battle he went to, but also felt elated when he cheated death. Yeah, I guess Thanatos wasn't really doing a great job, I guess. But yeah, so he had a pretty meteoric rise in command because he was a child soldier. He did enter, with family wealth into the army by aged 14. He participated at the Battle of Deitingen by 15, and by the age of 22, which would be 1749, he was already a lieutenant colonel in the British Army. He had and unlike the others, he was a pioneer. He had a reputation of turning on quite a few British regiments from complete slack units to some of the best trained, best functioning regiments of the British Army. And he was also known for drilling into new musketry tactics, the double loading. And this is going to be a key initiative at the Battle of Quebec that you would be talking about, Greg. He, however, was physically very fragile, tall, thin, with striking red hair. And some people say like his obsession about cheating death was due to his ill health. They speculated it was kidney stones and tuberculosis that plagued him throughout his life. And when critics complained to King George II that Wolfe was mad due to his eccentric intensity and young age, the king famously replied, "Mad is he? Then I hope he will bite some of my other generals." And he was also a pretty scholarly soldier because he did genuinely care for his men way more, especially if you compare to guys like Edward Braddock, who was just like sheer discipline and nothing more. He kind of adapted to the nature of the warfare here. He looked out for his men, gave them opportunities to learn. It's a little bit like what we talked about when we did the Battle of Jutland, what Admiral Jellicoe did for the soldiers at Scapa Flow. And I really respect such commanders in a way also that look out for their men. That's the true hallmark. But yeah, he was ultimately one of the youngest British major generals because at the age of 32, he was a major general in the British Army, which is impressive in any rights. But yeah, I just love the red hair dyeing.
I won't delve too much into the other commanders, but after said commanders go away for some reason, The French will be led by François Gaston de Lévis and Vaudreuil, more or less, because Vaudreuil is still the governor, so he has a lot of authority. On the English side, it'll be General Geoffrey Amherst, who would be taking supreme British command, overseeing basically the final years of the war. Again, I won't talk too much about that because Montcalm and Wolfe kind of embody this entire war in a lot of ways, and the most significant events are under them. And I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about the just a few of the native leaders, because there's far too many. There's too many tribes to actually talk about. And I will be butchering some of the names because I only have knowledge of some native languages. But the first leader, who's of the Seneca, was Tanacharson, who was also known as the half king of what is the Ohio country Iroquois. And he emerged as the pivotal Native American leader in the war's early phase through his vehement opposition to the French expansion. He was appointed deputy to the Iroquois Council of the Six Nations, and he viewed the French forts, especially at Presqu'île and Le Boeuf, as direct threats to the Iroquois influence. And he urged the British to destroy them as fast as they could. In 1753, he's going to be accompanying George Washington on that mission we were talking about to the Ohio Valley, and reinforcing his anti-French stance, getting them more involved in this war. And I don't want to get into the future history, but he's going to be the key figure.
I'm just saying how Simon is so happy listening to the words anti-French.
Oh, and you should know that when we say British, we can't really say the Americans, but the colonial people in what is like the colonies for the Americans, they really hate the French. The French are known as kind of the boogeymen who are paying natives to come into their settlements and kill their children. Like the French Indian War, there's a lot of bad blood between what is like the Quebecois, the Americans, and it's kind of this underlying thing that isn't as understood by the British and French. Yeah.
It was also like, I think, referenced right in Patriot a little bit.
Yeah, well, The Patriot is a very interesting movie because Mel Gibson's character is based off of a psychopath who was a murdering the swamp rat. Anyways, in American history, and I know Americans would be like, how dare you say this? Because I love that movie, but that movie's a little silly. I mean, the British are SS officers killing their own like citizens. Like, it doesn't make any sense. But yeah,
I guess you're referring to Colonel Tavington.
Oh yeah, like what a fantastic role.
That was Jonathan Isaac, right? Who played the role?
Burning really British civilians in a church. It doesn't make any sense, but yeah. Oh yeah, he's a great dragoon. But I had to say, so there's a lot of bad blood, definitely. Also, on the other side of this, there's the Ottawa leader Pontiac, who gained a lot of notoriety after the war because he was engaged in a lot of diplomacy and the warfare favoring the French, and he had been in a lot of the middle conflicts. He's coordinating the Algonquin-speaking tribes. I won't get into the history of that. There's different native languages. Maybe I'll put up the native map. One sec. I gotta open up my river. Sorry, audio listeners, as I continuously pull up stuff here. So you can see. So all of that light blue are... This map is a little bit... This map's actually really incorrect, but whatever. The Algonquin language speakers are kind of this group. They're very nomadic. They don't really control vast territories, unlike the Mohawks, for example, who are more sedentary. But yeah, so their great leader is Pontiac, and he's coordinating a lot of Algonquin-speaking tribes to try and resist the British incursions because they're the great allies of the French, and it's been a long-lasting relationship with the French. And they're helping raid and preserve the French outposts, such as at Fort Detroit. That's going to be an engagement in 1760, by the way. Pontiac's calculations, basically, he's prioritizing the French reliability because the fur trade is going on and it's been very lucrative for both sides. So he wants to keep business going. And he wants to make sure that he's accumulating all the traded goods from the French that he's been...
And I'm guessing also, since we mentioned, right, the French are heavily reliant on the natives. So he also knows that it's a source of...
Yeah.
So it's also a source of income for, hiring them out, right, as mercs.
Absolutely.
And I can imagine it's also a bit about security not having the stronger power right next to you is beneficial to your own security.
Yeah. They know doing business with the French means very, very little encroachment. The French are not expanding. I showed you the population, 60,000 versus a million on the other side. They're much happier being in the French realm than the British realm, because the British are expanding enormously, and the British are pressuring their native allies to hand and cede more territory, witch charters and all sorts of stuff. The French really not doing this. So it's pretty pragmatic for Pontiac, and he's going to be the key figure on the side. Another figure, Scaraldi of the Oneida, who's going to be succeeding Tenochtitlan, the Half King, to continue to guide the Iroquois in diplomacy and military efforts on the British side during kind of later years. He represents the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, and he has a lot of work navigating internal tribe divisions because they are definitely not very unified, and of course external pressures. And he's going to be involved in some battles in 1755 that I don't want to get into too much. But his warriors are going to be joining the British forces on scouting missions, expeditions, and fighting. We have here, a prominent Mohawk chief. So for the audience's sake, I don't want to say the reserve, although anyone could guess. I work for a Haudenosaunee reserve, and I understand a little bit of the Gainagea language. And so this tribal leader was Hendrik Tenyongwin, and he was an orator, and he was an ally to the British, and he played a critical role because he was representing, in English we call them the Mohawks, they go by the Haudenosaunee, Ongwe, Gainagahaga, you can call them, and they're kind of the backbone of the Iroquois. They're also the ones that everybody's afraid of. The other Aboriginal tribes, like the Algonquins, have names for the Mohawks, which translates into cannibal. That's how they see them, and rightfully so. The Mohawks were the most warlike of the northeastern tribes, and they definitely destroyed all the other tribes. They were dominant. Like there was very.
That was a bit scary to hear.
They rarely lost. The Algonquins are very outmanned by them in every aspect. And this is a tribal leader for them. He's going to be famously leading some forces during the Battle of Lake George. That's in 1755. And his forces helped repel the French advance by actually that German commander, Baron Dieskau. And they're going to be pivotal in his demise. There's also a leader of the Delaware. That's the Lenape tribe, and this is Shingas. He was allied with the French, and he emerged as a formidable raider and a strategist, and he's fighting in Pennsylvania and the Ohio frontiers, leading some pretty devastating attacks on British settlements in 1755. He was pretty disillusioned by the colonial land grabs and all of the broken treaties that were going around. This is on the British side, and he basically organized himself with the French. And he's going to be one of those guys that's pushing guerrilla warfare tactics, teaching the colonial French how to fight in the wilderness and such. There was also a Cherokee diplomat, and he was also a war chief. And excuse me, his name's a bit hard. Adekulakula. He was also known as Little Carpenter. And he would also be navigating like the alliance system with the British. He's part of the Confederacy. He would travel to Charleston in 1755 to secure some trading terms with the British and trade for arms. And he's going to get involved in all of this. I'm pretty sure that covers most of the native tribal leaders. There's a lot more. If you're looking at the map on YouTube, I couldn't possibly cover all of this. But to talk a little bit about how this war is going to be fought, battlefields are going to be in the Alpatchian and Laurentian forests, which demands a departure from traditional European warfare. The British initially clung to conventional linear tactics, so that's close order formations, volley fire. You need open fields for these kinds of fights. This is European style fighting, and this is disastrous in wooden terrain. Anybody seen the movie The Patriot that we keep talking about? When Mel Gibson ambushes that little British convoy at the beginning, that's exactly how these fights kind of go down. The rigidity starkly was exposed by a certain General Braddock when he's going to be doing an expedition.
I was about to talk about the Braddock expedition.
Yeah. Not going to talk about it yet, but discipline, ranked volley fire structure didn't really help him against what he was fighting. And it symbolizes a lot about this campaign. British commanders integrated provincial rangers for reconnaissance and skirmishing, which enhanced their flexibility in irregular operations. They eventually learned. Major Robert Rogers was kind of the guy who optimized all of this when he shifted the warfare in 1757 with rules of ranging, which was a 28-point manual for ranger companies. And this is drawn from like their frontier expeditions and their knowledge that they were getting from their native allies. So they were, prescribing.
Can we call this the Codex Astartes? Rangers in cavalry.
Yeah. So he's prescribing single file marches, sentry rotations, circuitous returns to evade pursuit, prioritizing strength, endurance, and small unit autonomy. And this is going to be codified into like the later years of the fighting. By contrast,
so they're like what we described in the previous episode, the light infantry skirmishing units of the set piece European battles.
Exactly. By contrast, the French, they're basically, their strategy is their network of fortified posts and controlling the riverways. And they're much more mobile because this is riverine warfare and they got kind of the monopoly on it. So they can move faster. When they're outnumbered, they lean heavily on their native allies to scout ahead for intelligence. And then they love to do guerrilla hit and run raids to, exploit the terrain and their concealment. And they love to do surprise ambushes and such. To motivate their allies, the French authorities offered scalping bounties. So this is what pissed off the Americans. So this is payments, for enemy scalps. And this would be acquired at any of their forts. So you can imagine these forts are everywhere in the interior. So constantly these colonial subjects are just being attacked by different native groups at any time. This really boosted morale for the French side. And it was certainly a deterrence. You didn't want to just wander into the interior if you're going to get scalped by a bunch of native raiding parties. So it's a element of psychological warfare too. So
Happy
this is
Genghis Khan noises.
yeah but again, this is like small scale. This isn't done like it's significant, but it's not going to win you a war per se. Now, victory in North America hinged not just on the battles, but sustaining forces across the vast hostile expanses. The British naval dominance solidified after 1755. This is really going to put the nail in the coffin for the French. If you can't, supply anybody in Nouvelle France, you're not going to win the war. And that's kind of what ends up happening. The idea of starving Canadians out, for example. Mm-hmm.
Did they have any commander that just willed for supplies to just appear out of nowhere?
What do you what do you mean by
it's
that?
just like certain commanders, right? They believe logistics is for the weak. You could just concord supplies out of thin air, reinforcements out of thin air. I guess they would just really like an Orkwag, but yeah, a certain Führer in World War II believed
exactly.
that.
Yeah. But the British thought that they had completely blockaded Quebec City, which is like really at the mouth of the St. Lawrence, and they never were capable of doing it. It turned out it was actually very difficult to watch every, we'll call it nook and cranny to getting into the St. Lawrence. So they were never really able to starve out Quebec properly as a result. But again, French naval weaknesses, they had very few in the area, divided squadrons, poor communication. They were never able to really challenge the British from a naval aspect. And I won't be talking about the naval warfare in this. There's too much information. We're already past an hour and haven't really gotten into the war, so we're gonna climb through this. And
this is just a thing on the fly. Maybe we'll have to extend the series a little bit, but we can give the battles that you regard then in a separate episode.
Yeah. Oh, I could do an entire series on all of this this campaigning and all that.
Yeah, we could just keep a second episode for just the battles that you have 18 battles. So definitely give it its due regards.
Sure.
Plus, I want to talk about James Wolfe's death so much.
All right. So the French are...
for the naval, you said the French pretty much abandoned the colonies. Would they actually have even tried?
It wasn't worth it to them. The fur trade was falling apart.
And honestly, by this point in time, as Craig alluded to, the Royal Navy was pretty much as in the ascendancy as the clear number one navy. Because I think you could say easily from the year 1600 onwards, Britain
Yeah,
tended to be either the number one or number two navy, and they had probably in the 1680s surpassed the Spanish as the number one navy, but their margin over the second place just kept growing, and it's not going to be till mid 1943 that the Royal Navy is finally surpassed.
yeah, pretty much. And just to reiterate, because I didn't really expressively say this, the French are going to be allied with the Algonquin speaking groups. So this is the Huron, the Wendat, the Ottawa, plus some Ohio Valley tribes such as the Delaware, the Lenape, and the Shawnee. And that's more or less the groups that are going to be fighting on their side. For the British, it's going to be the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee. So that's the Mohawk, Inada, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, and later Tuscarora, with some Mingo affiliates. And their ally, the British have the much stronger native allies than this. It really does show.
That included one of those Mohawk tribes, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm just speaking from a point of ignorance.
It's really confusing. Some of them are all Mohawk in some way, but the Haudenosaunee, it's hard to express what is a tribe and what isn't. So there's sub tribes, we'll call it, to make it, for lack of better words. So yeah, there's kind of more, but I'm brutally trying to summarize it. And now we're actually going to get into the war because my God, I'm going to try and bust through this as quickly as I can. So 53, like we had brought up that our friend George Washington, he was sent on that mission to Fort Le Boeuf, and basically they told him, nope, not going to happen. In
Craig,
yeah.
do you want to keep it as a separate episode, just as a suggestion? So we don't have to rush this.
Yo, you think we could do the battles? So this is like the the precursor to it. Yeah,
because
we could
then
do that.
we can give, and then we can also give a little bit of credit to the naval engagement as well.
Sure. Should we end with a battle, or should we end it here though?
I think let's talk about the fighting in the Ohio Valley that broke out up till 1756, because as I mentioned in the previous episode, that is also the uh you know it was known to the major powers of Europe before
we could talk about the breakout of war. Sure.
Yeah, so because war had already been going on here for almost a year and a half before it broke out in Europe.
Yeah, in 53 there was a bunch of battles that was going on. It wasn't considered part of what was the looming European theater war. But I think to end this episode off, I'll just talk about this first major engagement that Americans never really talk about. It's not significant in their history, but for the history of Nouvelle France, they consider this extremely significant. So I'll go into depth about this. Coming back to it, our friend, 21-year-old Major George Washington, he sent on a diplomatic mission in 1753, and he treks through, this winter terrain to Fort Le Boeuf, and this is near modern-day Erie, Pennsylvania, to demand that the French withdraw their forts, based off of the charters we were talking about. The French commander politely refused, asserting their claim. Washington was treated very well. No one was molested. Washington returns empty-handed, but his report fuels the British resolve. They want to counter this. So in April of 1754, De Windy dispatches Washington again, this time with 150 Virginia militiamen, to go build a fort at the Ohio Forks. So that's the site of Pittsburgh, modern-day Pittsburgh. The French, however, arrived to the scene first because their native allies were watching this, and they begin constructing Fort Duquesne. Pressing on, Washington, with some local Seneca warriors under Tenochtitlan, they're moving in, and on May the 28th, they ambush a 35-man French diplomatic party, which is led by Ensign Joseph Colon de Jumonville. And this is in a place that will be called Jumonville Glen in Pennsylvania. It's a extremely small, you can't even call it a battle, it's a skirmish, and about 10 to 13 Frenchmen are killed. Now, what's important to note about this is a highly contested event. And there is many sources on what happened, and they're very different. And I am definitely going to take some time to express what I think happens, and I think a lot of Americans would be pissed about this. But anyways, Washington's account of the battle, which there's several versions from the British side, are pretty consistent with one another, but the details are more and more compressed. And according to Fred Anderson, it seems that George Washington and the British in general were intent on obscuring some post-battle atrocities that occurred. So Washington himself wrote in his diary this: "We were advancing pretty near to them when they discovered us, whereupon I ordered my company to fire." That was Wargunder's company. "Received the entire fire of the French during the greatest part of the action, which only lasted a quarter of an hour, before the enemy was routed. We killed Mr. de Jumonville, their commander, and about 9 others. We wounded 1 and made 21 prisoners." So that's written in his diary. But I'm not going to read every account of this, but there's some accounts from French, British, and natives. One source from Monsieur, which was French, said that the French were trying to surrender, and then Washington opened up with 2 more volley shots, which killed Jumonville and the others. There's a British source that states while the surrender process was happening, the native allies with Washington wanted to scalp and, kill the French, and that Washington just allowed it to go forward. So in this version, the sources say that the leader, Tanacharasian himself, came over to a wounded Jumonville who would have been trying to surrender, and he said, "Tu n'es pas encore mort, mon père," which means "you're not dead yet, my father," a reference to a religious thing. And then he tomahawked him to death and scalped him. And his fellow tribesmen would do that to another 10. And this source states that's the majority of the killing. Now, there was another source I found, which is from native oral history, which states that the natives watched and tried to stop the British from gunning down the French as they were clearly surrendering. So there's a lot of sides trying to point out that the atrocity was committed by the other.
So Washington's account is like, yeah, it just happened in the battle, then they surrendered, everything was peace.
Exactly.
The British/Indian source mentioned that he let the atrocities happen, even though he probably might have been the commanding officer.
Mm-hmm.
The massacre, and the others the natives did not want that to happen, but the British did.
Yeah. So I would go without saying that if you look for the smallest denominator, either Washington just allowed the natives to do this, which back then was a real thing, and the officers were supposed to stop this from happening. Even like Montcalm historically would stop this many times from happening, which really pissed off his native allies and would be a detriment to the war for him. The French in general never let this happen. Some Americans will be screaming at me about a little massacre at Fort Henry, but we'll get into the realities of that later in a later episode. But to say the least, George Washington, this is a blemish on his career, and it's one that's never acknowledged by American sources, and I just wanted to point it out because I'm going to carry on with the story. There's something about this. So you can see this as Washington went over to the French. They treated him very well, like gentlemen, and then he did this. Now, after he takes his 21 prisoners, he goes back to Virginia.
Just one question. You did say that this French party of around 36 men in total, weren't they considered a diplomatic party as well?
Yes.
Which technically is a big violation of, the conduct of war.
A violation of conduct of war in North America this time is hard because you can blame it on your native allies. So it's kind of like everyone knows the rules, right? So sure, technically. But who says what happened? Like, as we can see here with the sources, it seems that Washington himself was trying to blemish it. So yeah, it was a breach. Words. Jumonville's half-brother, Captain Louis Colon de Villiers, he mobilized 600 French soldiers and their native allies, which is Odawa, Obijwe, and Potawatomi, to get revenge. On July the 3rd, Washington and about 400 men hastily constructed Fort Necessity in the Great Meadows. I don't know if you're able to pull up a did you find a map of, it would be called the Battle of Fort Necessity? If you can, it's all right, but I guess in the background, if you could just try to see if you can find one, perfect. So they've hastily tried to construct, like, we're talking Julius Caesar with the Romans trying to put up some wooden stockades and stuff right now because they know that they're about to get attacked, and
I'm
it's
sorry,
not going to
but
be good.
they are not going to be able to make a double donut.
Nope, they will not be. That technological knowledge has been lost to time. So they're trying to build this fort in the Great Meadows, and knowing that the French are advancing upon them with a lot of native allies, by the way, and they're going to be facing basically 600 French regulars, some Canadian militia, and the native allies, who are all being led, like I said, by Louis Caron du Villiers. Sorry, my screen keeps bugging out me. Okay, and at the time, they're also being besieged by rain, as well as superior numbers. So Washington's force, they suffer tremendous losses during this. I mean, it's still a small-scale battle, but for North America, it's a medium-sized battle. And Louis Caron de Villiers and his men, they're exhausting all of their powder and their ammunition while killing them. And the French are kind of like fearful. They think that the Americans are going to be receiving reinforcements to this position because everyone knows what the battle's going on. And the French decide that they're going to negotiate. So they send an officer under a white flag to Washington. Washington did not want to admit the Canadian officer into or near the fort. So he sent out 2 of his men. Amongst them was a translator who was Jacob von Bram, who was he was Dutch, if I remember correctly. And the French did not seek to disrupt, the peace between the 2 kingdoms because they're technically not at war yet. They wished only to avenge the murder of one of their officers, the bearer of the summons, and his escort. And they wanted to prevent any settlement on the lands belonging to their king. So they're, it's still the same conflict. As negotiations began, the Virginians, acting against Washington's orders, broke into the fort's liquor supply, and they all got drunk. And again, take this all with a grain of salt because a lot of different sources on this. Coulon then informed von Bram that all he desired was the surrender of the garrison, after which the Virginians could, unmolested, return to Virginia. He warned them, however, that if the surrender did not come early, he would unleash his native allies on the entire fort and they would be all scalped. This is common diplomacy at the time in North America. Von Bram conveyed Coulon's message to Washington, and I have to state here, the Dutchmen did not speak good French, and Washington had very rudimentary knowledge of the French language at the time, because I think Washington got better in French later. So there was a lot of mistranslation going on. It's going to play into this. But one of Coulon de Villiers' aides then penned Coulon's surrender terms, handed it over to Von Bram, who would pass it on to Washington. Washington, of course, can't read French at the time, so he asks Von Bram to translate it. The document stated that Jumonville was officially assassinated, though it is unclear if Von Bram understood the terminology that was being written. So it seems that a document was sent and the British didn't really understand what they would be signing. So in later years, Washington would insist that this was a translational error because this acknowledges what he had done, basically.
But I just acknowledge that he doesn't want to sign something he does not know what he's signing, which is a very fair thing. Always remember to do that, folks.
Yep.
It's good advice.
But so it gets, we'll call it signed under duress. But Washington and his men are completely left unmolested, even though the natives on the French side are very angry because this is lost money. Scalps is money. They want to do this. And the French let him go. So again, 2 times the French are extremely courteous to George Washington, and the time where he has the upper hand, he was a ruthless asshole. So I just want to put that out there.
How dare you treat our glorious hero like an actual person?
Yeah, exactly. And you can see that it's the first engagement. Yeah.
But then again, I did call, when we did our Generals in Europe series, I did openly say Montgomery, Rommel, Patton, all of some of the most overrated generals of the war.
Yeah, we got comments about that. Hey guys, this is Craig from the Pacific War Channel. Please don't forget to check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account over at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where you can join the ranks and gain access to a hell of a lot of goodies. At the base minimum, you get access to the exclusive monthly podcast, early access to all of my content, voting rights for what subjects I will tackle next, and at higher tiers, I have much more goodies to come. So please click that link and check it out. Obviously, I am not going to do too much of a brutal summarization, as it would take far too long to go through everything we said in the last episode. So I just came up with a cute thing in about 250 words. So in a nutshell, in the mid-18th century, tensions between Britain and France over North America, the territories there, boiled over, driven by, basically trade rivalries and unresolved border issues. And there was, the competition, of course, for the lucrative fur trade that was still going on at this time. British colonies with over 1 million settlers were hungry for westward expansion. They were clashing with Nouvelle-France's population of like 60,000 people.
When you're saying it was around 64,000 or so?
Yeah, it's insane.
So, folks, there are just 64,000 French in the blue, if you were to see the map, and there are like 1 million citizens of Britain in the red on America right now.
Yeah. That's why, and we're not going to get into all the details. As I was really stressing in the previous episode, it's such a paper tiger when you look at the map. Like, there is nobody in the Mississippi River Valley. It's just outposts. There's barely any French. So yeah, the Iowa County became a flashpoint. French explorers like La Salle claimed the region, while the British charters and their land companies, such as the Ohio Company of Virginia, were really trying to grab that fertile land. In 1749, French captain Saron de Blainville buried some lead plates to assert sovereignty in some of these outposts, warning off the British traders. By 1753, Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie sent one young Major George Washington, we talked a lot about him last episode, to demand French withdrawals from Fort Le Boeuf. The French refused, prompting Virginia to mobilize.
I would just add this very little snippet for Washington, for our American audience. It was thanks to his critical experiences that he gained in warfare in the 7 Years' War, which he would put to great use in the Revolutionary War.
Yep, absolutely. So, French refused. British mobilized. French forces built a chain of forts, including Presqu'île, Le Boeuf, and eventually Duquesne at the Ohio Forks. In 1754, Washington was leading some militiamen to go and counter them. Allied with the Seneca leader, Tenochtitlan, also known as the Half King, they ambushed a French party at Jumonville Glen, killing Ensign Jumonville amidst a lot of controversy. There were some atrocities there. We went into that situation in detail, so do check out the previous episode about how I'm arguing George Washington is kind of a dick and did some awful shit there. Regardless, retaliation came quite swift. French captain Louis Coulon du Villiers besieged Washington's hastily made fort at necessity. Washington was very outnumbered and battered by some heavy rain, and he would be forced to surrender on July the 4th. And this would mark Britain's first major defeat. And this is unofficially the first battle, or the battle that ignited the French and Indian War, which is part of the 7 Years' War that's coming.
Granted, it technically started more than a year before Frederick the Great invaded Silesia for the third time.
It's very awkward. They are two completely different, they're two different wars. It just so happens that because the fighting broke out in Europe, it just gave them more of a rationale to go to war in North America. So it's considered part of the 7 Years' War, but it's part of a chain of other wars.
I would just put it like you could just classify the French and Indian Wars and the Third Carnatic War, which we will also discuss in a future episode, the conflicts in India, as honestly proxy wars by Britain and France by the colonies, while the governments just had their major efforts in Europe. But they were completely separate since, Austria, Russia, Sweden, Prussia, they had absolutely no stake or care for what happened to their allies here. Unless, of course, for Frederick, it meant that supplies are not going to come through.
Yeah,
by the British.
They're very separate, but they are connected by one thing, and that is the naval aspect, which unfortunately we're not going to talk too much about. There isn't a whole lot to talk about. France didn't put a lot of efforts into protecting the seaway to Nouvelle France because they knew that they couldn't compete with the British. They had to face the British naval battles in well, I'll call it the European theater on that side of the Atlantic more so. And because of that, the French had very few successes against the British when it came here. The only thing the French really did was try to sneak over into the St. Lawrence Valley to get supplies to some of the larger, fortifications like at Quebec
But
and stuff.
yeah, just adding to that, it's also a necessity of geography. Britain being the island
Yeah.
nation,
Yes.
it makes sense for them to always focus on the navy over the army, which is like historically been Britain's strength, as we have discussed in our episodes of World War One, World War Two.
Hmm.
Whereas France does have a pretty large border
Yeah.
facing its enemies on continental Europe. So for them, it also does drain their manpower to deploy them into the land forces. I think a great example is when before Napoleon tried to in the Battle of the Third Coalition began, the number of men in the Grand Army ready to invade Britain, you could say, was equal to the number of people crewing for the Royal Navy at that.
Yeah. Jeez. Yeah, that's very true. And I mean, I guess spoiler alert. Simply because of the result of the naval aspect, France had no intention of actually trying to win. I mean, of course, they would love to retain their assets in North America, but they really put almost no resource towards this entire war. It was a
Yeah,
write
it
off.
was
They
just
know, yeah,
yeah. The idea was they make gains on the continent in Europe and then barter it away.
yeah. They were hoping to keep other assets, which was, of course, the Caribbean islands and such, with the growing sugar trade, which was overwhelming the fur trade. Because by this point in time, the fur trade was simmering down. The real money making of it had kind of, it was more or less done. Britain would still benefit heavily from the fur trade, but ironically, I think it's within the decade after the French and Indian War, it's basically completely crumbled. And but needless to say, that's another aspect of this. If you were looking at this on YouTube right now, you can see at the very bottom of this map, it shows the Washington expedition of 1754 to try and give you an idea of where this is all happening. And almost all battles in the French and Indian War are riverine or lake, which I don't know if you would classify that as a riverine battle, but it's a very complicated when it comes to maps because everything is just on different riverways. We're gonna do the best we can. I really tried to find the best looking maps I could to try and give us more of a good visual aspect. So, with that in mind, after that major defeat, it's August, and reports of the two battles are now back on the way to Britain. And following months of discussions, the Duke of Newcastle's government resolved to launch a military expedition the next year to oust the French forces. They selected one Major General Edward Braddock. I don't know if you'd like to. We did the bios in the last episode, but I thought it'd be worthwhile to do a few of them again.
Sure. Let me just bring up my favorite Assassin's Creed 3
Yeah,
villain.
I
Not
was gonna
really,
say.
but sorry. You just had to.
I know,
Because
I know.
Braddock was quite an interesting character in the game, even though he's just there for the, like, you could call it the prequel, like the tutorial phase of it. Just bear with me. I need to first, yeah, I'm just getting his Assassin's Creed portrait up because the official portraits are not that great. But Major General Edward Braddock, he is a pretty experienced soldier, born in 1695, was made a major general just in, during the War of Austrian Succession. That's where he really made his name. And, he was like a regimental foot commander during that entire war as he rose up through the ranks. And what he is known for is being an old school soldier. A lot of the French and British generals who were there at the start of this conflict, they are senior officers who served with their armies in Europe, and they are kind of wedded to that set piece battle, rigid style of thinking, of thought, which is great if you have plains and such. But right now, North America's more wilderness, and they do not know how to, they can't adapt quickly enough to the type of warfare that they're going to encounter against the Native Americans or the terrain. But he was an old school disciplinarian, close quarters, line formations, everything. And he arrives just in 1755 to North America with two new regiments and was tasked to drive the French outside of the Ohio River Valley. He would, lead the infamous Braddock expedition that was completely annihilated, to say the least. But, ultimately, it was just like a recipe for disaster given British uniforms, British friendly fire, and Braddock's insistence on rigid, tight formations. Kind of reminds, you could just call this a scaled down version of Teutoburg Forest, if you ask me.
Yeah, pretty much.
But Braddock was known in that expedition for his great courage. 4 horses were killed under him, you know, trying to rally his men until a gunshot finally, put him out of his misery, you could say.
You don't have to tease the battle we're about to talk about, but yeah.
True enough, but I'll just say this little thing. Washington did serve with him for some capacity when Braddock was for his limited time, and he would later be replaced, obviously, by 2 subsequent generals. Because right now he was the ranking
overall
British
commander,
general till his death.
Yeah,
but yeah, we would have another very illustrious general coming our way.
Yes, we would.
I'm gonna name him yet. But that's just a little bit I wanted to share about Braddock.
And for the other side, because details of the British strategy would reach the French long before Braddock even set sail for North America. In retaliation, King Louis XV sent 6 regiments to Nouvelle France in 1755, and they would be led by Baron Dieskau. Would you be able to say anything about him?
Yeah, one moment. I did manage to get a portrait of him, but it's not really a great quality.
I would like to just point out to anybody who is a Canadian in the audience or Quebecois, this was the overall commander of Nouvelle France who did a very good job in the beginning, and he wasn't technically French. Just want to say that one.
Yeah. So Baron Jean-Amand Descoings was a German soldier fighting for France. He was born in the state of Saxony, so one of the elected states that hates Prussia at this time. And he had a lot of experience fighting in the wars of Polish succession and Austrian succession. And he was pretty experienced because by the age of 46, already a couple of decades of experience, and is now a major general in the army of France, which is a pretty good achievement. He sent again in 1755 to North America after serving as a kind of like naval governor, because he was commanding the fortified town of Brest, which was key for the French Navy. And yeah, during his time, he was noted to be a pretty aggressive general, very ruthless in the way he went through, and well, it would lead to some pretty questionable decisions, but definitely the best commander the French could have had. I think that's a better term. He would later be captured and only released towards the after the conclusion of the entire conflict.
Yeah, I'm just gonna pull up an interesting map I found that goes through Washington's kind of experience during French and Indian War, but it also showcases Braddock's expedition quite well, and I think it looks pretty good compared to a lot of the older maps. The one thing I say about Dieskau is the guy who's going to succeed him, there's a real dichotomy between the two. Dieskau came to North America and learned immediately that the number one asset that he had was the Aboriginal allies and guerrilla warfare. He understood that the way that war worked in Europe was not going to work here. And he had a good relationship with his native allies, and he used them very well. And the person that will succeed him, which I don't want to tease, does the opposite. In fact, the person who succeeds him not only doesn't like using the native allies and hates guerrilla warfare, he doesn't like the militiamen, so the We'll call them the Québécois. They're not technically that yet, but doesn't work well with the locals, and that's kind of what really separates these two apart. And this guy is almost never
pretty
talked about.
Smart. Yeah, I'm just saying pretty smart for the second commander. Not revealing his name. I know who you're talking about. Considering you have only 64,000 population base against a million. Great idea.
Yeah, and not to mention, I'll get into it a little bit, rivalry with the governor, which really screwed everything up. So here we have Braddock is here, and Braddock was dispatched, being a veteran of the European campaigns, to lead. He was going to lead a major offensive. His primary mission was to capture Fort Duquesne, to expel the French, and to secure the region for British settlers and the fur traders. The expedition was part of a grand strategy orchestrated by the British government under Prime Minister Thomas Balham-Holles, the Duke of Newcastle, which involved simultaneous attacks on multiple French strongholds, and this would include Fort Niagara, Crown Point, and Acadia. Braddock's role was pivotal, as he was commander-in-chief of the British forces in North America, and he was going to be tasked with demonstrating military superiority, rallying colonial support, and reversing the earlier French victories, such as the one we talked about with George Washington at Fort Necessity. That was in 1754. The British aimed not only to reclaim territory, but also to deter the Native American alliances with the French had, ensuring, long-term control over the continent's interior. Because the British understood very well that the way to control this continent was to forge alliances with the strongest Aboriginal groups. And I won't get into it too much, but I'll share this. This is a breakdown of the quote-unquote Algonquin-speaking groups. This map's, to be honest, a little bit inaccurate, but you can think of that as those that are allied with the French. And then in the middle, you have the Iroquois Confederacy, which includes, the Ongwe, the Haudenosaunee, Kanien'kehá:ka, so the Mohawks, who are the strongest by a long shot group in this conflict. They absolutely bully what we would call the Algonquins, and it's been historically like that for a long time.
I think we had a great discussion about these various tribes and some of their leaders.
Yeah. They, obviously I'm a bit biased. I happen to work on a Mohawk reserve, so I know quite a lot about their history. And I'll note it here. The Algonquins would have words to describe the Kanien'kehá:ka, and they would basically be saying they're cannibals because they were terrified of them. And for good reason. The Mohawks are one of the most warlike native groups in the northeastern parts of North America. And they're the dominant big boys. They allied to who they thought was going to win the conflict, that more or less looked like the British. Weren't 100% on board in this war. There was some that fought on both sides and such, but more or less the British kind of won them over. And they're going to be fighting for the British, and that's going to be kind of the nail in the coffin for Nouvelle-France, to be honest, because it's the natives at war with each other during this conflict. It's like 80% of the actual show. And it's often not talked about, but there's a lot of micro wars going on between different tribes, different confederacies of tribes and such.
I'm guessing this is just a platform for them to also just focus on their personal grievances that they have against the different tribes or settlements.
Yeah. Anyone who's interested, in the first episode, we went into all the leaders of the various tribes that are important. A lot of them are using this situation to gain power over confederacies, to lead larger portions of tribes, to be able to make better treaties with any of the respective winners of this, which is obviously going to be the British. And also from a financial point of view, both sides were paying for scalps, especially the French. So there was a lot of money to be made getting scalps, and that's the way the war worked in North America, and it's been like that for like 100 years plus at this point. So yeah. And the British are looking to secure their alliances for the long-term control of everything. Braddock arrived in Virginia in February of 1755 with 2 regiments of regulars, bolstered by colonial troops, embodying, London's commitment to a decisive strike in this campaign. The British devised an ambitious strategy for military actions in 1755. Braddock was assigned command of the campaign against, I said, Fort Duquesne, whereas Massachusetts Governor William Shirley was charged with reinforcing Fort Oswego and launching an assault on Fort Niagara. Sir William Johnson was tasked with seizing Fort St. Frederick at Crown Point, And Lieutenant Colonel Robert Monckton was directed to take Fort Oswego, which is further east, along the border between Nova Scotia and Acadia. So, Braddock's campaign, as you can look on the map, you can see, here I have to pull it up myself, the general path over here in the red where he's going. Braddock's campaign called for an assault into the Ohio country, territory contested obviously by Britain and France. The region at this time was largely under French influence, thanks to Fort Duquesne, situated at the confluence of the Ohio River forks. So, Braddock assembled his army. It was about 2,400 men, 1,400 British regulars, and some provincial troops. And they'd be departing Fort Cumberland. That's in Maryland.
I think I'll just add this small little snippet. About 3,000 men is a pretty large force for this theater.
Yeah, for this theater, yes.
Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, the largest battles, which was the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, had a total of what, 10 to 12,000 troops or so.
Yeah, about.
If you include both sides.
Yeah.
And if you compare that to Europe, 12,000 sized armies on one side is just considered like a small division.
Yeah,
I did this math. Approximately 9 battles in the European theater had over 100,000 troops on both sides together.
Yeah, it's intense. Very different wars. Very different. They would be incorporating some artillery because unlike Europe, where sieges are not as prevalent anymore, sieges in the North American theater is actually kind of the dominant feature because there's a lot of very old fortifications that control the entrances to some of the Great Lakes or the riverways. I mean, obviously, like Gaurav was alluding to, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham is known as the Battle of Quebec, and it's because they were besieging the fortress of Quebec, which was the largest at the time. Actually, it was the pincushion to all of Nouvelle-France. It was the only thing that really needed to be taken down to kick down the door and everything. Colonial figures such as Benjamin Franklin would be helping secure wagons for Braddock. And the forces departed on June the 10th of 1755, hacking right through the forest towards the Monongahela River. To hasten the progress, Braddock split his troops, leading a flying column of 1,400 men. And aides like George Washington were offering, their local insights, but Braddock was adhering to traditional methods. He's actually quite a rigid person about this. He wasn't taking advice. Although Fort Duquesne had initially been minimally guarded, it had lately been bolstered by substantial reinforcements. The fort's commander, Claude Pierre Gadet de Contrecoeur, the old French names are hilarious, commanded approximately 1,600 personnel, comprising French troupes de la marine, Canadian militia, and Native American allies. Excuse me. Alarmed by the advancing British forces, he sent out Captain Daniel Léonard du Béjeu, leading about 800 soldiers, and this would include 108 troupes de la marine, 146 militiamen, and 600 indigenous warriors to go and ambush the British. Now I'm going to pull up this fantastic map here. And here, one sec. I'm going to have to zoom out a bit. It's a little bit zoomed in. There, that's better. On July the 9th, near the Monongahela River, at around 1 p.m., as the British vanguard under Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage was emerging into a clearing, they encountered the enemy. Gage's troops fired first, killing Béjeu despite the limitations of their muskets. The native warriors from tribes like the Ottawa, Ojibwa, and the Potawatomi took concealed positions in the forested terrain using trees and open spaces for stealthy movement. They employed psychological tactics such as displaying scalps of fallen British soldiers to emit some, terror into the British. And they were, of course, doing their war whoops, which sowed some panic amongst the troops. Initially, British volleys caused about 100 French to retreat, but Captain Dumas rallied the remainder. Under some heavy fire, Gage's unit suffered casualties and they were forced to pull back, colliding with Braddock's main force, who was advancing towards all this gunfire. Despite outnumbering their foes, the British found themselves on the defensive. Unfamiliar with the woodland combat, the regulars clung to tight formations, making them very easy targets for the flanking French and native forces. Confusion escalated, with friendly fire incidents also. The columns began to disintegrate. The attackers enveloped the British, sniping from the woods, while French regulars pushed along the road. Braddock attempted to rally his disorganized men, maintaining composure even as multiple horses were shot from underneath him. Efforts to deploy cannons completely failed due to it being a confined space. The British struggled to adapt to the guerrilla tactics. The provincial troops, more experienced in frontier fighting, sought cover behind trees, but they were sometimes mistaken for the enemy, leading to the friendly fire incidents. In contrast, the Virginia Regiment's rearguard effectively fought from a concealed position, a skill that was honed from earlier conflicts against the French and Indian forces. Despite the whole disarray, some British units held ranks and they fired volleys, with Braddock hoping that disciplined fire would eventually win the day. After 3 hours of fierce fighting, Braddock was mortally wounded, possibly by friendly fire, and he took a hit to the lung and he fell from his horse. With his fall, organized resistance completely crumbled. Fourth, yeah. And the British began to retreat without any formal orders. The withdrawal remained somewhat orderly until reaching the Monongahela River, where close quarters fighting, was happening, and it triggered a panic and basically a rout. George Washington, acting unofficially, organized a rearguard to try and cover the escape, enabling a lot of survivors to flee. The British losses were catastrophic. It was said that over 977 casualties were inflicted, including 63 of 86 officers. The French and Indian forces suffered around 40 casualties that they're claiming. I think it was a bit higher than that.
This is almost 50% of the British expedition that were killed or wounded, but a very high proportion of their leadership.
Survivors would flee across the river, abandoning most of their equipment, and this was a tremendous defeat. It exposed British vulnerabilities in frontier warfare, and it really boosted French morale. And this is early on in the war, of course. Now, I think it's time to pull up. 1 second, I'm going to pull up my.
Yeah, I just put a picture of this is a picture of the battle that was painted.
So Braddock is dead. William Shirley tried to step into the role of commanding British troops in North America. Not to get into it too much, but it's actually very confusing as to who is leading the British forces. And at some points, the French forces. It's kind of whoever is the strongman in the region takes over. But surely he's stepping into the big boy boots. And during December of 1755, he's gathering forces in Albany. And he details his strategy for the upcoming year, advocating for renewed offensives to seize Niagara, Crown Point, and Duquesne. So it's nothing different. He also suggested strikes against Fort Frontenac along Lake Ontario's northern edge, plus a venture through Maine, which was untamed back then, to go along the Chaulfay River to assault Quebec City, which is not a good idea. But anyways, his proposals were mired in some, conflicts with the other figures. So, of course, his counterpart is kind of William Johnson and New York's governor, Sir Charles Hardy, who are trying to take over in their own way. After the battle, the French actually obtained a duplicate of the British military strategy. They had the entire order of battle, everything, detailed all the operations that Shirley and Johnson were going to be undertaking. Shirley's attempts to strengthen Fort Oswego were hampered by supply chain issues, worsening by his complete lack of experience in overseeing major campaigns. He was way out of his depth, to be honest. Additionally, he learned that the French were assembling troops to strike Fort I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Oswego. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing it properly. While he was away planning his offensive against Fort Niagara. In reaction, he stationed troops at Oswego, Fort Bull, and Fort Williams, the later two situated along the Oneida Carry, linking the Mohawk River and Wood Creek near Rome, New York. Provisions would be stored at Fort Bull to support the anticipated assault on Niagara. Now, I just want to get my own little maps up here. So I have a entire Google Doc with maps. So there we go. Concurrent with Braddock's route, native warriors aligned with the French intensified their raids on British frontier settlements, exploiting the power vacuum and amplifying the colonial vulnerabilities through some hit-and-run attacks that disrupted the supply lines and was terrorizing the outlying communities. On September the 8th of 1755, near the southern end of Lake George in the province of New York, a confrontation would erupt between both sides. British forces under Sir William Johnson had established a camp. It was about 1,500 colonial militiamen and over 200 Iroquois allies led by Chief Hendrik Teongwin. Their goal was to push northwards against the French holdings. Opposing them was a French force commanded by Descalques, including 220 regular French Canadiens, 600 Canadian militiamen, and 700 Abenaki and Nipissing warriors who were marching south to intercept the British. Now, the day would begin with Johnson's decision to reinforce Fort Edward. He dispatched Colonel Abraham Williams with 1,000 troops and 250 Mohawks southwards along a rugged military road. But as the column was advancing through some dense woods and a narrow ravine 3 miles from the lake, disaster would strike. Hidden French grenadiers and their native allies opened fire from the flanks. Their musket volleys cut down the front ranks of the British. Williams fell almost immediately. He was shot through the head, and Hendrik was killed soon after in the chaos that was spreading. Panic would go through all the soldiers. They would be scrambling for cover, and many would retreat northwards towards Johnson's camp. The French pressed their advantage, and they pursued the fleeing British. A determined rearguard led by Lieutenant Colonel Seth Pomeroy and Nathan Whiting held the line, returning fire and slowing the attackers. In the exchange, French commander Jacques Lagadier de Saint-Pierre was struck down during the pursuit. Undeterred, Descalques rallied his forces and he advanced on Johnson's fortified camp, barricaded with wagons, boats, and felled trees.
I think this depiction is probably the best example of that last stand that's about to take place.
Yeah, that's it. The British, now alert, manned their defenses with artillery loaded for close-range devastation. As the French Canadiens charged in columns, cannon fire ripped through their lines, creating gaps and forcing a desperate struggle. The native forces stopped advancing, the Canadian troops grew quite fearful, and Descalques, commanding about 200 regular troops, had to carry the battle on alone going forward. Over the next 5 hours, the New England militiamen unleashed, quote, the most ferocious barrage ever witnessed in America. Nearly all of the French regulars were killed. Descalques sustained 3 wounds, but he declined to withdraw, instead positioning himself on a stump in full view of the gunfire. At last, spotting a soldier nearing him to take him prisoner, Descalques reached into his pocket for his watch to present it as a gift, apparently, to the guy. But the guy mistook him, as someone who was about to pull out a gun, obviously, and fired and delivered a wound that would eventually lead to Descalques' death 10 years later.
But that's a fair reaction.
Yeah. So he's like, you can imagine he's pulling this watch out of his pockets. The guy shot him. Descalques was not killed by this, by the way, but this wound would claim his life 10 years later.
It's
meanwhile,
quite a long died of wounds timeline.
It's kind of regular for the time period, though. You would, sometimes you get a bullet put in you and they would never take it out, and that would claim your life later. Stuff like that.
Fair enough.
Meanwhile, 2 miles south at a small pond, a relief force from Fort Edward under Captains Nathan Folsom and McGinnis encountered the retreating French baggage train and some stragglers. A sharp skirmish ensued with volleys exchanged amidst the underbrush. McGinnis was hit and later died of his wounds, but the British scattered the enemy, seizing supplies and prisoners. The pond's waters turned apparently red with all of the fallen, earning the nickname Bloody Pond. By the day's end, the British had held their ground, though at a great cost, around 223 dead and 108 wounded. French losses were very heavy as well, 149 dead, 163 wounded, and about 27 men were captured, including the gravely injured Descalques, who is the overall commander of French forces, mind you. This clash became known as the Battle of Lake George, and Descalques would remain a captive until 1763, when he would be traded back to France for some lucrative money. I would say probably a big price. And it was a decisive loss for the French, I would say.
Was it a ransom that he was traded for, or would it be like maybe exchanging of other generals?
I think it might have been a bit of both. I'm actually not sure. I want to say ransom. 1 sec, I'm just going to pull back up my generic map. Okay. So, we come to the year of 1756. It's January. Newcastle replaced Shirley with Lord Loudon, supported by Major General James Abercrombie. I don't think it's necessary to have a bio for him, but if you had anything to say.
Just a little bit. He is remembered for one reason, being one of the least successful British commanders of this entire conflict,
Yeah,
which is saying something.
that's why I was, yeah.
Yeah. So he was actually appointed as the second in command to Lord Loudon, but took over.
Mhm.
And unlike several other generals who were either very energetic or very methodical, right? There's a thinking and rationale. He was viewed as uninspiring and sluggish. The soldiers actually named him Old Abercrombie or Abbey Cross Your Fingers, reflecting his lack of confidence, their lack of confidence in his
Uh,
ability to make firm and tactical decisions. It makes me wonder, right? In our episode about the Seven Years' War in Europe, where Frederick the Great was on the verge of depression and wanted to commit suicide, and all his letters to his sister, and this guy on the other hand is portrayed, but he portrays that confidence to his generals, field marshals, and soldiers, and they are like, "My God, what a guy!" And then you have this guy. But continuing with that, the real brain was actually his second in command, a man called Lord George Howe, and who would unfortunately be killed like shortly before the disaster that is about to uh, go, like, head to Abercrombie's way. And yeah, I think this is just there's not really much worth saying about this man anymore because I don't want to give away the battles, because
yeah, of course.
his only major battle is his only major battle, you could say.
Very true. And there would be another counterpart because Dieskau is gone, so the French regular armed reinforcements would be arriving to Nouvelle-France in May of 1756. It's actually later on, but I just wanted to bring up that there will be a new commander. He's not there yet, and it's of course going to be Major General Louis Joseph de Montcalm. I think he's due a little biography if you can, Gaurav.
Yeah. So there's one thing Montcalm and Braddock have in common. They are the old school disciplinarians that come from the European school of thought of warfare. And, in fairness to them, both are highly experienced soldiers, having served, no doubt, in the wars that took place, such as the wars of Austrian succession and such. Uh, just got the portrait up of Montcalm. Apologies for the delay for that. But Montcalm right now is a lieutenant general, which is a very senior rank. Because keep in mind, lieutenant generals this time is much rarer than how you'd even see it later in World War One, World War Two eras. And this guy was a warrior, though. You got to give him that. He was wounded 5 times during the War of Austrian Succession, and he was very adherent to the European philosophy of war, of the set piece battle and disciplined lines of infantry. And unlike Braddock, he was actually able to deliver some results from the start. But similarly, this would also be his downfall because, as you mentioned a bit earlier, he could not work. He had a very low opinion of every Frenchman and Native American here except probably himself.
Mm-hmm.
He had probably the lowest opinion of the governor.
We'll be talking about right after him.
Yeah. But this would lead to a disastrous working relationship at the top. And as we've seen in so many incidents throughout wars and episodes we've covered, when you have such big stripes at your leadership level, you're doomed to fail anyways in the long run. You
Yes,
might still get your
indeed.
short-term victories, but you're never going to win the long term.
Mm-hmm. And his second in command would be Chevalier de Lavie and one Colonel François Charles de Bollemac, who were both experienced veterans of the War of the Austrian Succession. But before Montcalm enters the theater, someone else is technically in charge, and that is the French Governor General Pierre de Rigaud du Vaudreuil, who I will call the man who lost Nouvelle-France. Although people here in Quebec are told a bullshit version of history where he's actually the good guy. Do you want to say anything about Vaudreuil?
Yeah. So Vaudreuil was the first governor of Nouvelle France that was born
Yeah.
outside of France,
Yes.
and the last as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, bit harsh, but yeah. Just give me a second. God, it's so annoying going through these tabs, man. Yeah. But he was a very experienced administrator. He came, you could say, from the local nobility. He was the son of Philippe de Regnault de Vaudreuil, the previous governor general. So he was already established. He had an understanding of how to work with the various tribes,
Yes.
because with his experience in Louisiana and such, he understood what's the key to drafting effective treaties with them. And because he ultimately understood the realities of his situation here, and he could not get to work with Montcalm, both just ultimately just would be sabotaging each other instead of actually talking it out, which could have probably tipped the war. As mentioned, uh, Montcalm is the traditional mindset, the set piece battle of disciplined infantry, whereas Vaudreuil is guerrilla tactics, frontier raids, such ambushes. He has a good opinion of his Native American allies and the militia troops, whereas Montcalm is begging King Louis XV, like, please send me regular divisions. I don't want to deal with these peasants. Probably that's what his letter said.
I can actually
And
I can explain the division and
yeah,
strategy a
sure.
bit more.
Yeah, I
So
think great.
Montcalm, like you says, he's the traditional European warfare strategist, but he wants to pitch a battle. He wants a decisive battle to form a treaty and call it all done. He also wants to rush the war because he wants to go to Europe because he thinks this is all beneath him and he thinks it's hindering his career. So he's trying to end the war in Nouvelle-France so that he can go fight in Europe. If you could believe that, someone who's in charge of 60,000 people facing 1,000,000, it's very bold, but that was his
I mean, bro,
strategy.
he's got his rank, man. I mean, a lieutenant general is
Yeah.
a very high rank.
He considered this a demotion when he was sent over. He was very angry. There's a lot of letters back home to the wife and such. Whereas Governor Vaudreuil has been around for a long time, and his father and everyone else have been around, and they've been facing like 100+ years of similar wars, and the wars always seem to go the same way. Maybe a few pieces of territory are lost, but Nouvelle France survives. They believe that they aren't there to win a quote unquote war. What's going on in Europe has nothing to do with North America in his mind, and he's like, we just need to survive. He's like, just delay the British as long as possible, make it very hard for them to come up, give up the Ohio River Valley, whatever it is, but we won't lose Nouvelle France. His objective is to save what he's governor of. It's completely different from Montcalm. And like you said, Vaudreuil has a good relationship with the locals, being the militia. For Americans to understand, much like the Revolutionary War, look at Governor Vaudreuil kind of like Washington. He's kind of like a hero to the militiamen. He's born on the land. He's one of them, where he's not a quote unquote like a redcoat, in the other allegory. And he has established relationships with the native allies. Whereas when Montcalm comes into this, he doesn't know any of them. He has never met them. He doesn't know anything about them. So he has to kind of learn of all these new people in under a year and like form these relationships. So everything was kind of against Montcalm from the very beginning. Whereas Vaudreuil would be sitting on everything. And Vaudreuil would be using all of this against Montcalm because he wanted to take over. He thought that he could lead the campaign. So a lot of the problems, actually, it's Vaudreuil kind of going after Montcalm. But Vaudreuil...
To be fair, Montcalm also was equally stubborn in his attitude and refusal to work with him. So you can't solely blame him for the discord at the top of the Nouvelle France leadership.
Yeah, of course. I mean, they're both pig-headed idiots, and they both will be losing this war for two different reasons. But Vaudreuil fears that the British are going to launch, a spring offensive. Oh, sorry, they know because they actually have the order of battle. They captured all these documents that said exactly what the British are going to do, which is hilarious. So he's fearing the British spring offensive is, against the Niagara forts and Frontenac. So he dispatches a raiding party in late February. It's led by Lieutenant Gaspard Joseph Chassereau de Larry, a Canadian-born officer of the Troupes de la Marine, and the force is comprised of 84 regular Marines, 111 Canadian militiamen, and about 110 Indigenous allies. And that's primarily some Iroquois from Ganawagi and Garadasake, which, anyways, that's where I work, plus some Hurons. As you can see, there is some Mohawks that do fight on either side. They're kind of playing the odds, and the French look like they're doing very well right now. The expedition endured, some harsh winter conditions, traveling overland from Montreal. Tensions did arise as the Indigenous warriors preferred ambushes over direct assaults, to minimize their losses. On March 27th, they're going to be ambushing a British wagon of supplies, and one sec. I don't know if I should. No, I won't put up this map just yet. They're going to be ambushing a British wagon, totaling around 289 after the Indigenous start deserting. And after this little battle, they're going to be approaching Fort Bull. Actually, yeah, I will put up the map. So I have a map here. And please note at the very top corner, Fort Wood Creek is Fort Bull. It was renamed. So they're approaching Fort Bull under the cover of some trees. Alerted by war cries, the defenders closed their gates. The attackers fired through loopholes, demanded surrender multiple times, and used axes and battering rams to try and breach the entrance at around noon. The French militiamen charged with bayonets once they got in. Their Indigenous allies pursued all the stragglers. In a frenzy, most of the defenders were killed. It's about 59, and many of them would be scalped and mutilated, with just a few survivors taken prisoner. The French looted what they could, then they ignited the powder magazines, and they destroyed the fort and all of its vast stores. This included about 45,000 pounds of gunpowder, some cannonballs, provisions, etc. The French losses were extremely light, about 3 killed and 7 wounded, and this was a decisive blow to British logistics in the area, and it would very much delay the British offensives going forward.
Logistics wins wars, unlike certain generals we know and have criticized in our podcasts.
Yeah. I'm just gonna pull up 2 more maps. Sorry, we have so many maps in this one. I actually have a document to manage it. Okay. So the battles that we've just talked about, which are known as the battles of Lake George and Fort Bull, completely dashed the British aspirations for operations on Lake Ontario. And this left the Oswego garrison in peril, who were already struggling from depleted resources. The French troops in the Ohio Valley persisted in forging further alliances with the Native American groups, urging them to launch further raids on the outlying settlements. So from the British point of view, they're actually very fearful because they know that groups like the Mohawks, who have been kind of their most ardent ally, by the way, are willing to join the other side if the price is right. So they're getting really scared because they know that that'll tip the entire balance of this. On May the 17th, 1756, Britain formally declares war on France, expanding, the war in Europe, which is the 7 Years' War, of course. So the 7 Years' War is only kind of now. So technically, the French and Indian War began 2 years prior, I guess you could say, technically.
I mean, if you want to go by months, it's I think about 1.5 years or 18 to 19-ish months.
Montcalm is also arriving that same month, and he's immediately clashing with Vaudreuil over issues of command. After fortifying Fort Carillon, Montcalm joined Vaudreuil in planning the assault on Oswego. And again, I apologize. I'm pretty sure I'm saying this wrong, but I haven't had to say any of this since like high school history. Most of this history is like me brushing up. This is what we're taught in high school in Quebec. So I'm going to keep calling it Oswego. They're encouraged by all the successful raids going on. The fresh British leadership didn't materialize until July, although Abercrombie did reach Albany, where he was, trying to plan his major moves, and he was trying to get approval from Loudon. And this would allow Montcalm a lot of time to capitalize on all this hesitation to, do his own campaigns. Building on Vaudreuil's efforts to pressure the Oswego forts, Montcalm orchestrated a clever diversion by shifting his base to Carillon, which is also known, because I think the Americans call it more Ticonderoga. It's, you can call the fort either or. And
the only Ticonderoga I remember is that battle station at Starship Troopers in the first movie.
Yes, yeah. Oh my god, it's such a good movie and a good book. I tried to push Kings and Generals to let me do some fantasy work on their other channel for the Starship Troopers book.
Service guarantees you citizenship.
Yeah, they didn't let me. I'm still pushing them. So he's shifting he's making it look like he's shifting his stuff to Ticonderoga, suggesting that an impending strike was going to happen on Lake George. With Abercrombie stuck in Albany, Montcalm stealthily withdrew, and he orchestrated a assault on Fort Oswego, and that would occur in August. I think I can pull up a map now. Oh my god! Here, one sec. You have.
I got one.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's probably one of the best maps I could find, but that's
good.
For this era, a lot of these maps are really more handwritten notes that seem to have been transcribed.
Yeah, it's guys drawing. I know, it's really annoying. It's the river maps are hard to visualize. Well, one sec here. Actually, let me share this one because I think it might show off the fortification more, and I could also zoom in. Well, I can zoom in just a little bit. So this is the confluence of the Ontario.
Maybe you'd want to zoom out a little bit.
But yeah, one sec. It really zoomed in heavily. There we go. Okay. So on the British side, Shirley had prepared for an offensive, but he would be replaced by Earl of Loudon, which happened in July. And I would cancel all of his plans. The Oswego defenses were rather weak. Fort Ontario was in good repair, but undermanned. Fort Oswego had exposed stonework. Fort George was incomplete. The garrison was about 2,000, but it had been reduced to about 1,200 men because of fits of scurvy that was going on, and there was a lot of shortages of provisions because of all the raids that was going on. Assembled about 3,000 men at Fort Frontenac, including a bataillon from La Serre, Guyenne, and le Berne Régiment des Troupes de la Marine, colonial militia, and about 250 native allies from across Nouvelle-France. An advance party under François-Pierre du Rigaud, which, it's Vaudreuil, joined Villiers at Saquette Harbor, and the main force would cross Lake Ontario stealthily, landing east of Fort Ontario on August the 10th, completely undetected until the next morning. The next morning, French engineers surveyed the defenses while troops opened their siege trenches towards Fort Ontario. British defenders exchanged fire, but abandoned the fort on August the 13th under Colonel James Mercier's orders. Montcalm quickly occupied the high ground, positioning batteries to bombard Fort Oswego's exposed eastern side. By August the 14th, French cannons crumbled the walls. The British repositioned their guns, but they were simply outmatched. Rigaud's men crossed the river upstream, encircling the fort. Mercier was killed by a shell, and Lieutenant Colonel John Littlehals surrendered after a brief council. Montcalm denied the British honors of war due to their brief resistance. Chaos ensued as Canadian militia and their native allies plundered the fort, leading to some drunken violence. Some British escapees were killed, though Montcalm did intervene, later compensating them with gifts because, it looked really bad. The French captured about 1,600 prisoners, 121 cannons, several schooners, a large store of ammunition, some supplies, and this would effectively grant Nouvelle-France control over Lake Ontario and the western frontier until about 1758. So this was an enormous victory. The French had destroyed most of the boats and supplies before retreating back to Montreal with their prisoners. Oswego's fall ended British presence on Lake Ontario, and it would ease the threat to Fort Frontenac. Loudon blamed Shirley completely for what had happened. Actually, I just want to share this. This is a look at the attack on the fort, and this is how it would have looked back then. And back to, oh my god, I have so many tabs. This map. Okay. So in response,
I think just for the folks, you can see we can see Montcalm's movement here at Fort Oswego at the eastern shores of Lake Ontario, and so at least we know that that's where we are.
Yeah, no, that's why I'm trying so desperately to keep going back to this map, because this is an excellent map to show the movements of what's a very complicated riverine campaign. And it kind of gives you an idea of where there's movements, but this isn't like a war where someone is going in a direction to seize like a key objective. It's actually all over the place. So it's a very confusing campaign. But after this, in response, British colonial forces, they actually turned to irregular warfare. They were beginning to learn from their defeats. Major Robert Rogers Rangers would be conducting scouting raids and ambushes from bases like Fort William Henry to harass the French movements along Lake George and Champlain. Rogers' company, numbering about 100 to 200 men, would be executing guerrilla operations from 1756 to 1757. And they would probe pretty deep into French-held territory and inflict a lot of casualties, and they would gather intelligence. But they would face some setbacks. There was a battle known as the Battle of the Snowshoes, where French and native forces managed to ambush them. Now, in March of 1757, Montcalm attempts to attack Fort William Henry. And for those of you who have read the book or seen the movie The Last of the Mohicans, this is actually the battle that's depicted there. And Montcalm is actually in that movie, and he's depicted. I actually have a review on my channel. It's a very old video I did with an American history professor. I have a lot to say about the depiction of Montcalm and how he's speaking to his native allies, and he seems to be like really sly with them. It's not his character at all. It's just interesting. The movie tried to portray that way. So here's a map of Fort William Henry on Lake George here. So he's decided he's going to attack Fort William Henry, which is it's a very strong fort. And he's got about 1,600 French regular forces, some Canadian militiamen, and native allies. The fort at the time was lightly defended, had roughly 400 men of the 44th Foot and 3 companies of Rogers Rangers. The French would fail to take the fort the first time around, but they did manage to destroy nearly all of the supply depots, the boats, and the outbuildings. So they did give them quite a bloody nose. Montcalm would come back in August. This time he would have 3,000 French regulars, about 3,000 Canadian militiamen, and about 2,000 natives against Colonel George Monro, who would have a garrison of about 2,500 British regulars and militiamen. And they would unfortunately be suffering smallpox. There was an epidemic at the time. The battle would begin on August the 3rd when Montcalm advanced under Chevalier de Levis, who was blocking the road to Fort Edward, and they were isolating its garrison. Montcalm demanded surrender immediately, but Monro refused. Hoping that reinforcements from General Daniel Webb would arrive, he was about 16 miles to the south. The French forces opened the siege trenches northwest of the fort. They positioned their artillery to target its bastions. The bombardment commenced on August the 5th from about 2,000 yards, escalating with closer batteries, creating some deadly crossfire. The British returned fire, but it was ineffective. Many cannons were bursting or they were dismounted, and the walls were breached by August the 7th amid the rising casualties. An intercepted letter from Webb revealed no aid was actually coming, and after relentless shelling that had reduced the fort to complete rubble, Monro was forced to surrender by August the 9th. The surrender terms granted the British honorable withdrawal to Fort Edward, retaining their muskets, but they were not allowed to carry ammunition, with French protection from their native allies. So Americans probably know of this story. Something bad happens here. The supposed native allies were very frustrated because they had been denied the right of plunder and to take scalps, because obviously that's how they're making their money in all this. The French denied them of this. So they're going to violate the agreement. As the unarmed British column, which comprises not just soldiers, but women and children, because it's their families, even slaves and their, the servants and such, they were attacked by, they were ambushed by the natives, who would begin scalping, killing, and capturing prisoners. Chaos ensued, and some French officers, including Montcalm himself, would eventually intervene when they found out. Yeah, there's a lot of depictions of this one. Some people will say that Montcalm did nothing at all. He says that he tried to intervene when he found out. Are you trying to say something, Gaurav? I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I was just I brought up an image also that is kind of showing like, a French officer or probably Montcalm in this just stopping the native warriors. But I think this was also the story that haunted the protagonist in The Patriot, right? Mel Gibson's character.
Yes, it's in The Last of the Mohican. This is kind of the pivotal scene in the movie, and in The Patriot, Mel Gibson's character is based off of two characters. He's kind of the swamp rat, but all of his backstory is alluding to the French and Indian War, where he was a mass murdering psychopath. By the way, the character Mel Gibson plays is a horrendous human being, but yeah, some of that would go back to this infamous massacre, as it would become known, the William Henry Massacre. Eyewitness accounts describe like horrific scenes. Wounded prisoners were just butchered in huts, families were separated, and stragglers were just tomahawked to death. Modern estimates suggest 69 to 184 British were killed. At the time, there was propaganda saying like it was like 1,000 people were killed, with 500 initially captured. A lot of people would be ransomed because the natives were trying to make money, obviously. The event was one of the most this was one of the most notorious atrocities during the entire war, and again, it actually is kind of the product
Just a
of
question.
multiple other atrocities. Yeah.
Do the natives also believe in the ransoming system?
Absolutely. So they could get money for scalps, but like let's say you captured family members of officers and the officers weren't present, you could ransom them. They understood everything that the French or the English were doing. I mean, not to go into the history of it, but a lot of American and Canadian history love to portray Aboriginals as kind of like children in a way, that they were or that they were not in control, or that they were unaware of how things work. This is not true. They were like everybody else. They were fighting their own war for their own territory, and they understood the game.
Money always speaks, right? Yeah. Doesn't matter which era.
Yeah. They understood what they needed to be able to form treaties to protect their land. And they were this is one of the biggest moments in the history for the Northeast American native groups to like try and fend off these people that are, going to be settling in their territory. So they're doing as much as they can for influence, and they know money, power, fear, psychological warfare, everything's being put out.
Yeah, and I'm guessing it's the usual rule also still applies, right? Like those who are senior officers, administrators, or families of them will obviously be ransomed for much higher sums than, let's just say, a soldier or maybe like a lieutenant or captain.
Yeah, particularly from the Mohawks. The Mohawks have the most experience when it comes to this type of warfare, and they know how to play the game. And they're playing both sides, very much so. So yeah,
it just kind of reminds me a little bit of Agincourt. The British soldiers were so... Yeah. The English soldiers were so pissed off with King Henry V because he ordered a lot of the prisoners to be butchered to deter a relief army, but again, because they knew that ransoming is like going to be a good bounty for them.
Yeah. The Aboriginal groups understand, because they're watching the Europeans fight, that the Europeans, it's one thing to, like, let's say you just raise a town and you kill everybody. There's a psychological warfare element to that. But if you start capturing the families of officers and then start ransoming, I mean, you're going to do much more damage in the long run. So they have an understanding of this. But this event, the Fort William Henry Massacre, is probably it has to be the worst atrocity during this war. It's one of many that has happened over the past 100 years, and it's going to deteriorate the relationship of Montcalm with his native allies, as well as obviously on the other side to the British. It's going to be used for propaganda purposes heavily. The British are going to be talking about it for a long time. I'm just trying to organize my maps a bit. God, I have so many. But yeah, so this is probably one of the worst atrocities. And
But I guess right now you could call it, this is the zenith. We could call the zenith of French military success in
yes, this is
theater
kind of the end
operations.
of it. Yeah. So the victories temporarily consolidated Nouvelle-France's hold on the Great Lakes and the upper Hudson Valley, with the capture of Fort Oswego, denying Britain basically a western expansion route. But mounting European commitments were going to limit Montcalm's ability to exploit them. So Montcalm is going to be receiving basically no reinforcements from Europe, but Europe is going to be reinforced. The British are going to be reinforcing. Loudon now orders William Pitt, the Secretary of State, who's also the man responsible for the colonies, to attack Louisbourg.
This is William Pitt the Elder, folks, by the way, not his son.
I'm just going to pull up another map. So under William Pitt's direction, Britain's now shifting its strategy to prioritize North American conquest through amphibious operations and coordinated land campaigns, backed by increased military funding and some colonial reinforcements. The policy funded expeditions with professional regulars and provincial troops, emphasizing, naval superiority to try and win battles now, and to try and enable some strikes against the key French strongholds. The expedition was going to be beset with a lot of delays, but they will sail from Halifax eventually. Here, one sec. I'm just going to put up my map again. Okay. So in early August, they're going to be sailing from Nova Scotia. In the meantime, French ships have actually escaped a British blockade of the coast, and of the French coast, that is, and a fleet is awaiting Loudon at Louisbourg, which outnumbered the British fleet. Faced with this strength, Loudon returned to New York amidst news that the massacre had just occurred at Fort William Henry. So after the failed British expedition in 1757, this prompted Prime Minister William Pitt to launch a renewed effort in 1758. Amherst is going to be leading with an army who's going to be, his subordinates are going to be Brigadiers James Wolfe, Charles Lawrence, and Edward Whitmore. I guess at this point, should we talk about James Wolfe?
Yeah, though I think you could say that right now Wolfe was also promoted to Major General at this time.
Yes.
So his promotion did just come just as he was setting off. One moment, let me just bring up a image of one of the most eccentric British commanders of the age, to say the least. Just give me a sec. Oh god, so many tabs, man. Yep, finally found it. So James Wolfe, he's a very young commander. At the time, he is 31 years old in 1758 when he is arriving in theater, but already a major general in the British Army, which is quite an achievement. He comes from a established military family. His father already was a general in the army, and he it was a unique case of, I could say, for how he went up the ranks. This time, the commission era was still popular, so a lot of generals and officers in all major armies bought their commissions with family wealth. Wolfe, despite having the connections, advanced on sheer skill alone. Though some people call him a bit crazy in his obsessive devotion to the craft. The guy was serving in the British Army by the age of 14. He fought at the Battle of Dettingen, which was one of the key battles of the during the War of Austrian Succession. Age 22, was a lieutenant colonel in the British Army. It's quite an achievement, to say the very least. And he was reputed as one of the best trainers of the British Army, turning like really shit units into a disciplined and efficient fighting force. And he also pioneered the use of the double loading, where he had his men put two musket balls into the opening shots. Kind of similar to how in Trafalgar, the first British salvos all the cannons were double shotted to really rake the French broadsides. It's a similar concept. He was a disciplinarian, but he was not as, rigid as General Braddock. And some called him, a mad person, which actually his critics called him mad, actually, which prompted them to complain to King George that this guy's crazy, you should not let him be in the army. And it is reported that King George II was said, "Mad is he? Then I hope he will bite some of my other generals." And he did look out for his men genuinely. Like while he trained and disciplined them, he looked out for their comfort. He let them, like, wear, you could call it more looser regulation clothing in North America, kind of like just improving their comfort, which really helps with the morale. So that's all I'm going to talk about James Wolfe. And also, the last fact is, unlike the distinguished gentleman look of powdering his hair white, he never did that. So he would stand out, and he always believed he was going to die in battle. Every battle was his last.
Yeah, right. And excuse me, I made an error when I was doing my little narrative in my notes. I was alluding to the battle and I glossed over it. So just talk about what actually happened with the siege. So Amherst, as I said, he sends this army with brigaders, well, with James Wolfe's part of it. There's also Charles Lawrence, Edwards Whitmore with Tuscanawan, and they're commanding some naval forces. The French under Gouverneur Augustin de Beauharnais de Durcar anticipated the attack, but faced naval shortages after the British blockades prevented reinforcements from France coming in. The British assembled a massive force in Halifax, 150 transports and 40 warships carrying nearly 14,000 soldiers, mostly regulars, divided into 3 brigades. The French defenses included about 3,500 regulars.
By going against militia and Native American mercenaries, this is sizable firepower.
Oh, this is a lot. The French
and redcoats were already pretty well reputed.
Yep. So the French defenses include about 3,500 regulars, 3,500 Marines and sailors, plus some Micmac allies, totaling around 7,000. Ducar's fortified trenches, and he would have fortified trenches, and he would be sinking some ships to block the harbor entrance, leaving about 5 warships inside to help them defend. The British ground forces would comprise some elite units like Rogers Rangers, Gortham's Rangers, and some regiments of the 1st, 15th, 17th, 22nd, 28th, 35th, 40th, 45th, 47th, 48th, 58th, and 60th Royal American Forces, and the 78th Fraser's Highlanders. They'd have about 70 cannons, some mortars that would be led by...
That's pretty insane for this theater.
Yes, this is a huge upgrade. Artillery would be led by John Henry Bastide. French troops included the 2nd Bataillon d'Artois, Bourgogne, Cambis, the foreign volunteer regiments, plus the Campagne Franche de la Marine, the Bombardiers, Canadian militiamen, and other indigenous allies. There's a lot of the weather was pretty bad, delayed the British landing until about June the 8th, when Wolfe's division secured a beachhead at Gabarus Bay, despite heavy French fire, outflanking defenses at Kennington Cove. By June the 12th, Wolfe captured Lighthouse Point, enabling an artillery bombardment from about June the 19th onwards. British guns demolished the walls and the buildings. On July the 21st, a motor-ignited Cerebre spreading fire to Entreprenant and Capriccio. 2 days later, the King's Bastion burned, shattering French morale. On July the 25th, under some fog, British raiders captured Bienfaisant and burnt Prudent, clearing the harbor. Power surrendered on July the 26th, and Amherst would deny honors of war, citing the atrocities that had happened at William Henry. The French garrison destroyed their flags and their muskets in protest. The siege would cost the British 172 killed, 355 wounded. The French losses were about 102 killed, 303 wounded, with over 5,600 men captured. So the fall of Louisbourg triggered a second wave of the Acadian expulsions, which I can't get into the history of the expulsions of the Acadians. Huge thing that really hurt a large group of people. And so more people are getting deported from New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island to Newfoundland, etc. It's about 3,100 Acadians, and about 1,649 of them would perish this time around. The capture would also provide Britain control over the Gulf of the St. Lawrence River entrance, serving as a staging point for the future advance against Quebec. I want to bring back up this map. So yeah, if you look over here, you can see the entrance that's going to happen. So Louisbourg on that very tip over there to the northeast, that's taken down. Now they can come into the St. Lawrence. So Major General James Abercrombie's Lake Champlain expedition, which is happening simultaneously, not going as well. Do you want to pull up the map or me? The map for the next upcoming one is going to be the Battle of Fort Carillon or Ticonderoga.
I just have it. Just give me a second.
Not a problem.
Might as well just get into it.
Yeah. So Abercrombie, he's fielding about 6,000 regulars and about 12,000 provincial troops. This is rangers and native allies and such. And they're making an advance against Fort Carillon. Montcalm knew the British would advance from Lake George, and he had bolstered the garrison to nearly 3,000 French regulars, 500 Canadian militiamen, about 600 native allies. The battle unfolded primarily on forested roads and such. There was about a 3/4 of a mile part just northwest of the fort, where Montcalm had hastily constructed some defensive works. Anticipating the British advance, he positioned his troops behind earthen breastworks reinforced with felled trees, with sharpened branches, forming a quite deadly barrier. The French forces were organized into 3 brigades. Montcalm was in the center, with the Royal Roussillon and the Berry regiments. Chevalier du Léfy was on the right, with Bern, Guyon, and Rachaine. And François Charles du Boulamac was on the left, with Larcer and Languedoc. It's a weird name. Reserves and cannon were in the redoubts, and they were flanking the lines, with militias guarding the low ground near La Chute River. Abercrombie relied on flawed reconnaissance, which was given by an engineer named Matthew Clark, who opted for a direct frontal assault without field artillery, ignoring options like flanking maneuvers or sieging the fort for that matter. The British advanced in 3 columns around noon. The right was under William Haviland. In the center was John Donaldson, and to the left was Francis Grant. It was preceded by some light infantry and some rangers, and they charged into withering French musket fire and cannon fire. The assaults began absolutely chaotically, with New York provincials engaging early on, pulling regulars into piecemeal attacks. Waves of British troops, including desperate charges by the 42nd Highlanders, briefly reached the breastworks, and they were cut down by enfilading fire and bayonets. Abercrombie persisted until the evening, but failed attempts to position artillery at Rattlesnake Hill, also known as Mount Defiance, and float guns down La Chute River, compounded a complete disaster. By dusk, the British retreated in disorder to Lake George, panicked by rumors that they were being pursued. The casualties were staggering. It was actually one of the bloodiest engagements in the war. Over 2,000 British were killed or wounded, including heavy losses to the 42nd, who had about 300 dead, versus about 400 casualties for the French. Montcalm's defense, despite being outnumbered and having a lot of vulnerabilities, his fort, for that matter, could have been easily sieged. They repelled a numerically superior foe, so this really improved morale for the French again. Further south, and I'm going to bring back my map again.
So when I was talking about Abercrombie, this was the only battle he commanded, and got his ass handed to him, to say the least.
It's very.
He was recalled to Britain, though he never held command again. But can you beat it? He actually got promoted later to lieutenant general, and then became a full general in the British Army, more owing to political connections. But he was never given any consideration for any expedition again.
Yeah, this was an extravagant defeat, to say the least. So even further south, Brigadier General John Forbes, he had a campaign to capture Fort Duquesne in late 1758 through some road construction across a lot of wilderness, avoiding Braddock's earlier mistakes, by the way, because he didn't want to get ambushed. Advancing with about 7,000 men, including some provincials under George Washington again, Forbes reached the Ohio Forks by early December, after French forces evacuated and burned down the fort on November the 25th when they abandoned it. And the British renamed the site Fort Pitt. The French just gave it up. Cherokee warriors aligned with the British southern colonies in 1758 aided frontier defenses against French-aligned troops to stabilize Virginia and Carolina's borders. However, deteriorating relations from supply disputes and mistreatment of the Cherokees and their envoys foreshadowed the Anglo-Cherokee War. That's a completely other thing, and we can't get into. Just wanted to bring that up because, again, I'm guilty as anybody. It's hard, and this is already going over time. It's hard to talk about all the Aboriginal wars that are involved in this. It's a lot in the background. So, July of 1758, after the defeat at the Battle of Carillon, the British captured Louisbourg in August, of course. And now this places Atlantic Canada in British hands, and it's opening the sea route to Quebec. That same month, they also would be seizing Fort Frontenac, depriving the French of vital supplies for the Ohio Valley campaign. So in 1758, the French experienced some very unfavorable outcomes on a lot of the fronts of the conflict. With the Duc de Choiseul newly appointed as foreign minister, he shifted priorities towards launching an invasion of Britain, aiming to redirect British forces and supplies from North America and continental Europe. But this strategy would collapse. On both the military and political front, William Pitt renewed his aggressive operations against New France and allocated funding to Britain's key European partner, Prussia, while the French fleet would suffer defeats in 1759, so some naval engagements at Lagos and Cabon Bay. All these setbacks basically means that the French supply vessels are trying their best to slip past British blockades to get to Nouvelle-France to supply the men, but certainly there's not much reinforcements coming over. Several indigenous allies of Nouvelle-France are making peace with the British, and this is compelling France to basically just start withdrawing troops. They think the paint's on the wall, and they think that it's all is lost. Governor Vaudreuil and General Montcalm are very uneasy about all of this, obviously. Nonetheless, Quebec remains defiant, and it seems that the British are going to prepare a three-pronged offensive for 1759. Now, due to Wolfe's conduct during the siege of Louisbourg, William Pitt and elders select him to command the British offensive against Quebec City. And I'm just going to pull up. Okay, here, I got one more map. There we go. Just for my own coordination of all these maps and these tabs. Wolfe's going to be driving the offensive against Quebec City. While Wolfe received a temporary promotion to Major General for his service, he retained only the rank of full colonel back in Europe. Amherst was named Commander-in-Chief of North America, tasked with leading a distinct and more substantial army to invade Canada.
I really find this, temporary promotions quite a strange concept in a way.
Yes, yeah.
I think this is a great example. Eisenhower, even until 1943, while he had all the temporary ranks of brigadier general, major general, etc., he still officially, since 1939, his full rank was still just a colonel, even though by now he had masterminded Operation Torch and everything. And he only got a promotion, full promotion to major general in August 1943.
Yeah. One thing to note about Wolfe, he demanded that his close friend, the Irish officer Guy Carleton, be appointed to quartermaster general, and he threatened to step down if this request was not met. So Amherst proceeded to organize the expedition. Pitt remained committed to prioritize military efforts in North America, intending to undermine Nouvelle-France's, existence. In July of 1759, British forces under General Jean Prideaux and Sir William Johnson conducted a siege of Fort Niagara. I'll just only briefly talk about this one. It is kind of a side piece. So this is the area of Fort Niagara. It's over on the east in the map, or to the right in the map, better said, which was, of course, the key stronghold on the Great Lakes and the Western Territories. The operation began on July the 6th with about 2,500 British regulars, provincials, and some Iroquois allies encircling the fort. And it was held by about 400 French troops and some native auxiliaries. After 19 days of artillery bombardment and some skirmishes, Prideaux died from friendly fire, and Johnson accepted Pochel's surrender on July 25th, capturing the fort and severing the French supply lines to the interior. This is basically places like Detroit. The victory isolated French forces in Canada proper, disrupting their ability to reinforce the western garrisons amidst all of the British naval blockades. Now, pull this back up. Wolfe was entrusted, like I said, with the mission to seize the fortified stronghold of Quebec. Admiral Saunders was responsible for transporting the British forces to Quebec and provide ongoing support to Wolfe. So, I'm going to pull up. Ooh, got so many maps. Here we go. A map of the area.
I was about to get the same
Yeah,
map
sorry.
up.
Yeah, I'm all
No
over
worries.
the place in this one. So, after reaching the area, the forces established a camp about 5 kilometers from Quebec City on the Ile d'Orléans, where many French residents had already fled, following reports of the Louisbourg defeat. Once their base was secure, Wolfe directed his gunners to commence shelling upon Quebec City. Although the relentless barrage certainly, demoralized the civilians, it really posed no significant threat. The fort was extremely strong. From the outset, Wolfe recognized that victory would depend on luring the French forces out of their strongholds for a decisive battle. However, the French commander, Montcalm, remained cautious about deploying his soldiers in a major assault or fixed position. Confident that the British effort would falter due to dwindling provisions, also because winter was certainly going to hurt them, Montcalm emphasized a defensive posture. Consequently, French counteractions, their guerrilla warfare, was proving effective to, do little bit of damage to the British. At first, while they were continuing through summer, the primary focus lay east of Quebec City. Montcalm excelled in defensive tactics at this point. By August of 1759, both armies, particularly the British, were exhausted from months of sporadic clashes, and Wolfe had yet to achieve any breakthrough. Realizing his operation was nearing collapse, Wolfe rallied his depleted forces for a final offensive. He believed the key to triumph was going to be in the east, but his brigadier generals proposed striking the west instead. Achieving surprise was critical. Frustrated by Montcalm's defensive tactics, Wolfe shifted his strategy in late August, opting for a very daring upstream landing at Anse-du-Foulon, a cove 3 kilometers west of Quebec. I actually just need to look at the map. Okay, yeah, it's marked.
It's at the bottom left of the map, yeah.
I want to make sure it's seen for the audience. Montcalm's forces in Quebec City and along the Beauport shore totaled about 13,390 regular troops, including troupes de la marine, some militia, about 200 cavalry, 200 artillery. And this is not including the guns at Quebec City itself. They also fielded about 400 native warriors, which is not much for this time. These would be led by Ottawa, and there would be 140 Acadian volunteers and some other irregulars. However, most of these troops would not even participate in the upcoming battle. The militia was largely inexperienced, while the Acadians, Canadians, and indigenous regulars were much more accustomed to guerrilla warfare than siege warfare. By contrast, the British are fielding about 7,700 troops. Nearly all of them are regulars. During the battle itself, Wolfe would be commanding 4,426 British Army soldiers with 2 bronze 6-pounders. Montcalm would come into the battle itself with about 2,000 French regulars, 600 Canadian militiamen who were drafted into regular forces, so they're more regular than irregular at this point, and he would have another 1,800 militiamen and native allies. So I want to talk about something here, because this is something that you are not properly told in the Quebec education system at high school. This is something that's actually usually hidden. Vaudreuil, who was still governor at this point, he makes a critical error. Basically, he is tricked. That's the best way to put it. So, despite intelligence warnings of a potential British landing at Foulon, Vaudreuil only assigns a small and poorly motivated detachment of about 100 militiamen under Captain Louis de La Pont, de Chambon, de Vergère to guard a path up the cliffs between Cape d'Amont and Cape Rouge on the night of September the 12th. Long story short, the British pulled a trick. They were unloading troops and sending ships in an opposite direction, making it look like they were actually landing somewhere else, and Vaudreuil falls for it. This oversight, compounded by Vaudreuil's ongoing rivalry with Montcalm over strategy, as he favors irregular warfare, does not want to pitch a battle, leaves these cliffs vulnerable, and it completely enables the British to land and perform a surprise attack. And more or less, Vaudreuil has lost the battle for Nouvelle-France. Here and there, this critical error has already basically screwed up the entire battle. I will admit, Montcalm's reaction is not good either, and he further fucks things up. But the first one really to screw things up is Vaudreuil. So, sentries, they don't notice the boats on the river that morning. And basically what ends up happening is the French were expecting a supply drop. So there was a convoy that was supposed to be coming. And when these British ships show up, a French-speaking officer aboard them, which was Captain Fraser, or possibly one Captain Donald MacDonald of the 78th Fraser Highlanders, they start calling in French towards the French on the coast. So the French just believe it's not the British. It's as stupid as that. The boats drift off course and they land soldiers on the foot of the slope rather than on the road's base. No one even bats an eye at this. 24 volunteers led by Colonel William Howe with fixed bayonets clear the road picket and they climb up the slope, moving behind.
Honestly, this just reminds me of that battle like in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood when you're about to kill the Baron de Valois Ezio. How Ezio just acts like a French officer.
Yeah. So as you can imagine, they're behind Vega's camp, and they just capture it. I mean, they overwhelm it. Wolfe arrives about an hour later, and now we're coming to dawn, and Wolfe has deployed his 4,400 men in a very thin line across the plains of Abraham. He's completely taken the French by surprise, and he's anchored his blood, how do we put this? In World War II terms, he's secured a beachhead, and it's very much secured. The plateau is completely undefended, save for Vega's little camp there, as Vaudreuil ordered basically all the forces to go to the east of the city, because he thought that's where the landing was actually going to happen, because he's been completely duped. And now there is no immediate defenders to meet the enemy. And the British when they were forming their beachhead, had Vaudreuil not fallen for this, it probably would have been a massacre. Montcalm would have been given ample time to turn this into just one of the worst landings, and the battle would not have gone this way.
Yeah, the most effective defense against any amphibious operation is smashing them right as they're landing because they don't have the numbers.
Exactly. Instead, not only have the British landed and formed lines, they got their artillery across. Not much, mind you, it's like 6 cannons, but it's in perfect position to start whaling. Montcalm is completely taken by surprise. He is forced to make a decision, and instead of waiting for reinforcements like he should have, because Colonel Louis Antoine de Bougainville is further upstream, he basically says he's going to fight them. So Montcalm decides to go with a decisive engagement, and it's very premature. So Montcalm is guilty as well. He really screwed this up. And he's going to go with a frontal attack and try for a rear attack, so you can try on a hook. But it's not going to go very well. Now, when he confronted Wolfe, Montcalm would actually explain, because he was questioned about his orders. He said to an artillery officer, Montbéliard, we cannot avoid the action. The enemy is entrenching. He already has 2 pieces of cannon. If we give him time to establish himself, we shall never be able to attack him with the troops that we have already. So Montcalm felt he had to engage them decisively now because the British were just going to get a better and better position. Had he delayed, the British would be fighting and they would be cut off, because obviously you could attack the seaway here. Montcalm really should have waited. So on September the 13th, Wolfe's army forms a line with its back to the river, and it's stretching across the plains of Abraham. The British left faced a bluff and a wooden approach above Saint-Charles, while the Canadian militia and their native sharpshooters are harassing the British left from the cover of trees and some scrub. They eventually anchored the line at the bridge over Saint-Charles, though. The British deployed roughly 3,300 men in a shallow horseshoe across the plains, the main firing line about 1 kilometer long. 2 battalions faced north to cover the left flank, with reserves behind. To cover the entire area, Wolfe had to place his troops 2 ranks deep. On the left, Townshend's regiments clashed with militia in the scrub, seizing a handful of houses and some mills to anchor the line. The French set some houses ablaze during their retreat to deny them to the British, and the smoke from the fires probably obscured Montcalm's view of what was going on. Wolfe's men, under some heavy fire, lay low in some tall grass and brush to endure Montcalm's bombardments. Montcalm mounted, and he pressed for a rapid assault. He directed roughly about 3,500 of his men right into the action without waiting. He, of course, being, rigid with European tactics, favored large orderly formations, and came at them. And they suffered from inconsistent discipline because a lot of the men with him were not regulars, and they did not know how to fight like a regular force. And this really diminished their effectiveness at close range combat. The British held their fire as the French approached within about 30 yards, then unleashed a double volley that absolutely shattered the French advance and sent them into a retreat.
Credit to James Wolfe for that, since he's the one who pioneered that shooting technique.
Wolfe observed from a high rise with the 28th foot and Wolfe, he was wounded himself early on. He was hit in the wrist, and then he would be mortally wounded, and he would actually die after he would die. I don't know how many hours it took for him to die, but he took a mortal wound. The British pursued the enemy, including the famous Highland Charge by the 78th Fraser Highlanders, pressing into the retreating men who were trying to make a resistance near the city, aided by some of their artillery. Bougainville's column would approach from Cap Rouge, but Townsend redirected 2 battalions to meet the threat. Bougainville withdrew as Montcalm's army pulled back across the Saint Charles. Montcalm was also mortally wounded, and he would reach Quebec shortly after, and he would die in the early hours. I don't know if you want to pull up, the famous painting. So this one, yeah.
Yeah, so Montcalm actually would die the next day.
Yes, in bed.
Yeah, but I think with, James Wolfe did die during the battle.
Battle itself, yeah.
Which, honestly, I would call that a kindness in comparison. It's better than having like a slow, painful death, so.
Yeah, it's true.
One moment. I just got that image up. I'm just going to share it.
It is interesting that both commanders were killed.
You say this was the painting you're referring to?
So both commanders receive mortal wounds during the battle and die. Most history books will end it here, even though technically the war is not over. Montcalm and Wolfe are dead. British losses for the Battle of Quebec, or also known as the Battle of Plains Abraham, is about 658 casualties. The French losses are roughly about 716 casualties, with another 350 captured during the battle itself, including about 13 officers.
Actually, if you just considering Montcalm engaged with slightly less forces, like I think about 3,800 or so troops against 4,400 of the Brits, it's actually like a pretty big loss.
Yeah. The British pursuit was checked by French rearguards, like I had mentioned, but Quebec's defenses have completely collapsed, and by September the 18th, the city capitulates. Meanwhile, the French, who are more or less led by Vaudreuil, they try to regroup in Montreal. Here, one sec. I'm going to just bring up my map again, because I'm not ending it there like all the textbooks. They try to regroup at Montreal. Early in 1760, reinforcements arrived from France, actually, aboard the ship Vanguard, which evaded the British blockades. Lévis, who was Montcalm's successor, assembled a 7,000-strong army, including some regulars, militiamen, some indigenous allies, and they tried to march on Quebec to retake it in April. Their goal was, of course, to recapture the city before British ships could reinforce it, and before the St. Lawrence River was thawing. Murray, who was in control in the area, was aware the French were approaching, and he ventured out to destroy the French artillery at Point Levis and other fortified positions across the Plains Abraham. However, facing superior numbers, he prepared for a defensive battle in the end. Levis at this battle was commanding approximately 5,000 troops in the field, about 2,100 French regulars from regiments like Berry, La Sarre, Languedoc, Guyenne, Béarn, and the Royal Roussillon, 2,900 Canadian militiamen, and some indigenous warriors. And his forces were very motivated and well supplied for the offensive. On the other side would be Murray, who had an army that was about 4,000 strong, and it would also include some rangers and other volunteers. They were weakened by the winter hardships, and they were relying on the entrenchments, and they had about 150 artillery pieces that were salvaged from the previous year's battle. On April the 28th, Lévis advanced on the British lines at Sainte-Foy, which is a suburb west of Quebec. Murray, positioned on some higher ground with flanks anchored by windmills, initially held an advantage. The French attacked in some columns, with militia and grenadiers leading the assaults on the British right and left flanks. Intense fighting ensued amidst snow and mud. The French forces captured key positions, including Dumont's windmill on the British right, forcing Murray to commit his reserves. British artillery inflicted heavy casualties, but Lévis's efforts outflanked the British left, causing their lines to completely crumble. They then ordered a retreat to the walls of Quebec after 2 hours of combat, abandoning a lot of his artillery. Casualties were very high. The French losses were 193 killed, 640 wounded. The British suffered about 260 deaths, 829 wounded. This is a battle almost no one talks about, by the way. It happens right after. Lévis then besieges Quebec, bombarding the city and trying to tighten a noose around it. Murray's garrison, now critically low on supplies, faces starvation. However, on May the 9th, the British ship HMS Vanguard arrives, followed by HMS Louis Stuff and a fleet under Commodore Robert Swanton, who lifts the siege. And Lévis lacks any naval support, so he has to retreat to Montreal. By 1760, the British strategy now shifts to a multi-pronged campaign against the remaining French holdings, with Major General Amherst directing 3 converging armies totaling 17,000 men to compel Montreal's fall. His main force, over 10,000, comes from Lake Ontario, and then he also has James Murray's men, about 4,000 from Quebec, coming along the Riverway, and William Haviland's 3,500 men coming from Fort Crown Point, northwards via the Richelieu River. The French are about 3,200 regulars, with a very diminishing militia and a huge decline in native support. They have fortified positions, but they're facing a lot of desertions and they have a lack of supplies. Murray's forced to
I'll just add this one thing about Amherst. He was actually, like a lot of his peers considered him like overly cautious, too reluctant to engage. But this operation that you're about to describe, his 3-pronged attack to pretty much win the theater, you could say, that was the fruit of all his methodical planning, and the results will speak for itself. So yeah, sometimes people can plan way too much, like a certain American Civil War general.
Yeah.
But when you then have to execute that plan.
Murray's force departed Quebec on July 13th. They advanced along the St. Lawrence River with naval support, facing just sporadic resistance. Murray conducted successful pacification campaigns in the area, disarming thousands of Canadians, securing oaths of loyalty. Because, to be honest, when Vaudreuil, we'll talk about it in a bit. The war is kind of over. They're ceding territory and stuff, so everyone kind of knows. By late August, after minor skirmishes at Sorel and Varennes, his troops encamped near Montreal, having neutralized much of the local militia. Amherst's larger column left Oswego on August the 10th. They navigate, treacherous rapids to get there. They're besieged a little bit. They besiege and capture Fort Lévis, which is renamed Fort William Augustus afterwards, after some engagements. By September the 6th, Amherst lands in Lachine. Unopposed, Haviland advances from Crown Point on August the 11th, targeting French defenses along Richelieu, with Robert Rogers' Rangers bombarding and capturing Illinois, seizing French vessels and forts like Saint-Jean and Chambly. Desertions are plaguing the French, who are now fighting under Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, who is basically bottled up in Montreal. Montreal is effectively surrounded by September the 7th. The city's defenses were inadequate against artillery, and its garrison, reduced to about 2,400 troops, face a swollen population who are completely unwilling to fight. Vaudreuil calls a council with militia desertions and indigenous allies now defecting to the enemy. Resistance is deemed impossible. Negotiations ensue. Amherst rejects honors of war, citing the French native atrocities, demanding unconditional surrender. On September the 8th, Vaudreuil signs the capitulation or the capitulation cortège, ceding Canada, or Nouvelle-France for that matter, and its dependencies. French troops lay down their arms, and the British forces occupy Montreal. And that effectively ended French power north of Ohio. Now, Amherst agreed to several of the French residents' requests at the time. Those who chose to remain in the colony would be allowed to practice Catholic worship, own property, and live in their homes without interference. The British also provided medical care to the sick and wounded French soldiers. Additionally, French regular troops were repatriated to France aboard British ships, with the stipulation that they would not serve in the current 7 Years' War. Overall war losses for all of this underscored the conflict's attrition. British forces suffered approximately 10,000 casualties, if you really look at it, predominantly from disease in campaigns throughout the war, while the French regulars incurred about maybe 3,000 killed in action or from wounds, and their native allies suffered thousands of deaths as well in all the other battles that are going on in the background. Following Montreal's capitulation, the British Commander-in-Chief Amherst directed efforts to secure remote French outposts in the Great Lakes region, the Ohio regions. And this is against isolated garrisons that were still, for whatever reason, fighting back. So in the late, even 1761, Major Robert Rogers led his Rangers to accept the surrenders of other forts, in Detroit and stuff. But the war is over. And as the peace talks would later unfold in Europe, French commitments would shift to defending the Caribbean holdings, culminating in, Britain's going to capture Havana in 1762, for example. It's going to basically divert any focus from North America. And in 1763, the Treaty of Paris would be finally signed. Britain offered France a choice: surrender its continental holdings in North America, east of the Mississippi River, or they could cede the Caribbean islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique, which had been occupied already by Britain. France chose the islands over all of North America, of course.
Money speaks.
Yep. And they actually negotiated the retention of two very small islands, Saint Pierre and what's the other island? Miquelon, I think it is, that are just on the shores of Quebec, near the Gulf of St. Lawrence River. To this day, they're awkwardly there. Very, very weird place to visit. It's, so Canada was, just taken over for a few Caribbean islands, basically. That's the way to put it.
So that's what you guys are worth?
Yeah. That is more or less the bastardized story of the French and Indian War, which is just a side theater of the 7 Years' War.
Yeah, and you could say, most of Louisiana, I think some parts of Upper Louisiana were ceded, right, to the British after the treaties. But most of Louisiana is now going to be the sole French possessions on the colony as well, which would later be sold.
Which makes no sense, by the way. No, there's no one there. I've never understood how they could protect that. Anyways, yeah.
I guess that's pretty much why Napoleon sold it later.
Exactly. It's one of the weirdest stories. But
who did he sell it to? The British only?
Yeah.
So wait, he sold territory to the British to finance a war against them.
Yeah. I know, it's crazy. But before I let the audience off the hook, and I do apologize for rushing the end half of this. We were really going over time. And this was all supposed to be one episode, by the way. I royally underestimated how long this would take. I like to say, if you haven't joined us on YouTube, well, please do so. It would make a lot more sense to you if you're looking at the maps with us, because I know we try to make this optimized for audio listeners as it is a podcast, but it is sometimes hard when we are ourselves looking at the maps. Also, I'd like to remind everyone, if you'd like to further support the channel, consider checking out the YouTube membership, which has been growing notably as of late. It's kind of outpacing the Patreon account a little bit. Or you can join the Patreon at www.patreon.com/PacificWarChannel. It's the same price. You get the exact same benefits by joining either or. So it's up to you. My preference would be, of course, Patreon, because YouTube takes literally like 50% of everything you give us. But by joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, get early access to all the content I make. And as of a few days ago, I just posted a brand new video that looks at it's a very bizarre video looking at the connection between a theoretical pistol sword used in the Pacific War and how it relates to Final Fantasy VIII's gunblades. So you can piece together that one in your mind. Or you also get voting rights for all the polls I put up for the subjects I'll tackle next. Gaurav, thank you for letting me take you hostage, and I can't wait for you to cover the India theater of all this.
Oh God, I'm nervous because I have not studied that as well since like I think fifth or sixth grade. Jeez, that's almost 20 years ago.
Kind of the same situation for me. I have not looked into this history since I think it's grade 9 we do this. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think we'll be returning to Europe for the next episode. Get to one episode, then we'll probably take a call on how many episodes we might need. We did plan that India and North America, the theaters would be one entire episode, but I think we both underestimated that.
Yes, we did. Well, until next time. Cool.